Story 1. I didn't know what to do. My fingers nervously fiddled with the keys on my old laptop, and my thoughts were tangled in my head, like a web I couldn't tear apart. Everything was as usual, a foggy morning, a forest outside the window, only I was back in this house, empty, cold, full of memories. Harley, my faithful dog, lay quietly on the rug by the fireplace, her eyes following my every move, but there was something strange in her gaze. This wasn't just a day where I could sit and do nothing. Something was wrong today. The forest seemed more desolate than ever. The silence that usually brought peace now only made me feel more alone. The days spent in this solitude are starting to take their toll on me. More and more often I begin to doubt my resolve to stay here, away from people in the noisy world. When I first moved into this house, it seemed like I'd found a place where I could live out all my fears and worries, where silence would be a friend instead of an enemy. But now, after a few months, I began to notice something odd. Harley's gentle behavior, her loyal shadow that followed me around the house, now seemed unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something important that I didn't know about. Every evening when night fell and I tried to fall asleep, it seemed to me that she was standing next to the bed and watching me carefully. At some point, I stopped noticing her presence, but one look into her dark eyes, and I again felt the cold in my chest. She was always there, quietly, unnoticed as always. She approached me. I didn't see her move, but I could smell her, barely perceptible, like foul wood smoke. At first I thought it was just my fatigue affecting my perception, but then, all of a sudden, I heard something strange. A bark. That same deep, rolling bark I'd known from the start. It came from Harley, but its timbre was different. It didn't sound like her usual bark. It was alien, low and shrill, as if it wasn't her, but something else that had taken on her appearance. I tried to open the door and check what was going on, but at that moment she stood between me and the exit. She stood motionless, like a stone statue, and I couldn't understand what was wrong with her. She didn't feel any danger. Moreover, her gaze became calm, almost peaceful, like a predator watching its prey. As I turned away to look at the laptop screen again, my hand suddenly froze. On the computer screen was text I didn't remember typing. It was clear, but the words were strange, unfamiliar. I quickly closed the screen, thinking it was some kind of bug, a software error. But another line appeared on the screen, and another, and another. The text became more and more disturbing, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It reminded me of everything I was trying to avoid, and in that moment I realized that something was wrong in this house. I didn't know how to explain it, but the feeling that someone was watching me became so strong that I couldn't even breathe calmly. Suddenly I heard her footsteps, or was it someone else? I wasn't sure, but they got louder, and then she started barking. I jumped up and ran to the door to open it, but as I grabbed her, I had a feeling that I was wrong, that I shouldn't do this. I stood in the hallway, feeling my hands getting wet with sweat. Suddenly I turned around. Harley, standing by the door, was looking at me as if she wanted to tell me something, but her gaze was still so alien and unnatural. I grabbed her collar and pulled her toward the room, deciding that I needed some time to come to my senses and understand what was happening. But when we went inside, she suddenly twisted like a snake and tore herself out of my arms. I found myself in an empty room, in which there was now no one but me. The dog was gone, only that strange text on the screen. I tried to find an explanation for what was happening, but I increasingly felt like there was something in this house that I couldn't understand, and it didn't seem like it was going to just go away. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I felt the room was getting colder. I decided to go outside, get some fresh air, and try to clear my thoughts. But as soon as I opened the door, I felt a sharp gust of wind that immediately froze in the air. The whole forest was silent, as if holding its breath. I closed the door and went back into the room. This time I couldn't figure out what was happening to my perception. I felt as if the space around me was starting to change. Everything seemed blurred, as if I wasn't quite there, but somewhere far away. I sat down on a chair by the window and glanced at the clock. It was 5:30, although I was sure it had been longer. Time was somehow losing its precision here. When I looked at the computer, the text on the screen changed again. It was getting longer and longer, and with each word I felt a growing sense of unease. It was as if someone or something was trying to convey a message to me, but I couldn't make out what it meant. With each new symbol, I began to understand that all this was not accidental. My hands, already starting to shake, were ready to turn off the computer, but something was holding me back. The feeling of uncertainty and anxiety became unbearable. At that moment I felt the door shake. It was such a light, almost imperceptible knock, but it was there. I stood up and walked to the door, feeling my pulse quicken. I opened it and looked out into the hallway, but there was nothing there. Just a dark, empty hallway with no sounds or footsteps. I went back to the desk and looked at the screen again, but there was only one word: search. I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. I sat in a dark room, staring at the computer screen that continued to glow despite the darkness around me. Last night seemed too real, too haunting, and I couldn't shake the memory of strange events. Harley, my dog, had been so strange that night that I began to doubt whether I had actually seen her. Perhaps I had imagined something, but if so, why did this anxiety not leave me? Today I didn't know what to do. The sunlight barely filtered through the windows, making the room seem even more gloomy. I stood up and looked out the window, but the forest seemed as quiet as ever. I tried to focus on something else, work, the tasks I needed to complete. But the more I tried, the more I became overcome with this strange fear that just wouldn't go away. The silence that I had previously found so peaceful now felt oppressive. I remembered the text on the screen. It was clear, and every word seemed part of some plan I couldn't understand. The word search still hung in the air, like a question I couldn't answer. Where to search? What to search? And why did I feel like I needed to do this right now? My thoughts were jumbled, but I knew one thing: I had to do something. Deciding that I could no longer remain in this state of limbo, I stood up and walked toward the door. My steps seemed so heavy, as if each step was taken with effort, as if I were overcoming some invisible resistance. I opened the door and, despite my doubts, stepped into the hallway. Suddenly, I felt a cold wave of horror wash over me. It was dark and lifeless in here. I tried to listen, but I could hear nothing but my own breathing. I felt something unpleasant, like a cold wind, pierce me, and for a moment I felt uneasy. Something in the air was wrong. I couldn't even figure out what it was. I turned around, and at that moment I noticed that the corridor had become even darker, as if the light was disappearing, swallowed up by this strange darkness. At that moment, I heard the footsteps again, but I couldn't see their source. They were moving right behind me. It wasn't the sound of my own footsteps, it was something else, something that was following me. Unnoticed and silent, I froze. The fear I felt was almost physical. I didn't know what to do. Run? Hide? But in some deep corner of my soul, I knew it was inevitable. With effort, I moved further down the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest, and my legs seemed not to obey me. I suddenly realized that I needed to go back to my room. The same question was sounding in my head: what should I look for? But the answer did not come. I decided to go back to the computer. Maybe it would give me some kind of clue. When I was back at the table, I felt the tension in the room grow even stronger. Everything around me seemed distorted, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I opened my laptop and looked at the screen again, hoping that the text would appear again, as before. And it did, but now it was longer, and the words were becoming more and more disturbing. And again there was that same word, search, but now it was accompanied by the phrase, you know where to look. I felt a cold sweat rise on my neck. But what was I supposed to be looking for? Thoughts began to float through my head, and one of them, almost unconsciously, began to emerge into my consciousness. I remembered an old photograph I'd found in the house. It wasn't just any photograph. It was old, with fuzzy edges, and it showed the place where I now lived. A place that looked different, like it was there but in some other time. I could have simply forgotten it, but whenever I thought about it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this photograph was the key. I stood up and walked back to the part of the house where I had found it. My hand was shaking as I opened the desk drawer where I kept old papers. A moment later, there it was, a photograph. I looked at it. This time I noticed details I hadn't seen before. Someone was in the photograph. It was a man standing in the distance, against the backdrop of the forest, with an expression on his face that seemed familiar. The face was blurry, but I had a clear sense that this wasn't just a coincidence. On the back of the photograph was a note: never come back here. I felt the cold creeping back into me, and suddenly I knew this place wasn't just home, it was more. And I needed to figure out what it was. With every step I took through this house, I felt myself getting closer to the answer. But the closer I got to the answer, the more I felt like I might never actually get out. I stood up, put the photograph down, and looked out the window. The forest beyond was silent, but now, with this new knowledge, it seemed different. The darkness around me wasn't just darkness. It was living, penetrating darkness. And here I was, in the very center of it, with someone watching me, hidden in this house, waiting for me to find what I needed. I sat by the window, staring out into the forest. The wind creaked through the branches of the trees, and their shadows danced across the floor. The forest looked as empty as ever, but today something felt different, as if the air itself had become heavy, filled with an invisible weight. I could feel the weight pressing down on me. It was hard to breathe. I thought that the loneliness of this house would be my refuge, but over time it became its own punishment. At first, everything was different. The forest that I once perceived as protection was now just an endless wasteland. Everything around was hidden in shadow, and I couldn't figure out what exactly was bothering me. It wasn't just my thoughts that were making me feel this way. These strange events that were starting to happen were baffling me. What happened yesterday wouldn't leave my mind. I couldn't forget the moment I opened the door and felt like I was being watched. That strange cold I had encountered wouldn't leave me. Even now, sitting by the window, I felt like something was watching me, hidden in the shadows of the trees where the light never came through. Then I remembered how happy I was the first day I moved here. I thought it would be the perfect place to work, relax, and escape all that didn't make sense. I enjoyed the solitude, but with each passing day, the place was turning into something else. I felt the walls closing in and the air getting thicker. Thinking about last night, I remembered how strange Harley had been. She had always been a loyal friend, never showing signs of aggression. But on that night walk, something had changed. It was as if she sensed something I hadn't noticed. She began barking into the air, her fur standing on end, and her behavior had become nervous. I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen. And even when we returned to the house, She continued to stare at the door, as if expecting something. I couldn't help but notice how her eyes began to glow in the dark as she suddenly turned toward me and barked like she never had before. It wasn't a normal bark. It was a deep, hollow sound that made me freeze. I tried to figure out what was going on. Was it her usual fear of nighttime noises or something more sinister? Was it some kind of warning? I didn't know. My thoughts went back to the night when I decided to check what was going on behind the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was waiting for me outside the house. I stood up and headed for the door, but I felt my hands become heavy, as if something invisible was preventing me from taking a step. I stood by the door, wondering if I should open it. Taking a deep breath, I finally made up my mind. I opened the door and stepped out onto the veranda. The forest seemed lifeless, fog lay on the ground, and the air was cold as ice. I wanted to go back inside, but I couldn't take my eyes off the forest. Something was wrong. I thought I knew what was happening, but I couldn't remember why this place scared me so much. Suddenly I heard footsteps. They were quieter than my own, but I knew someone was coming. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. It sounded too much like Harley's footsteps, but I couldn't believe she was there. I turned around again to look at her place in the house. She wasn't there, but the footsteps continued, and they were getting closer. I hurried back inside, but as soon as I took a step toward the door, I heard those footsteps again. Now they were right behind me, and in that moment I realized I wasn't alone. Something was watching me, and it wasn't just my paranoia. It was real. I felt sweat break out on my back. I turned around and saw a shadow moving quickly between the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew it couldn't be a person. It was something that moved too quickly, too quietly. It was something unnatural, something that lurked in the shadows. I couldn't figure out what it was, but a feeling of dread filled me. I re-entered the house, closing the door behind me, and caught my breath with difficulty. The state of fear did not leave me, but I understood that I needed to somehow calm down. I went to my room, but the same thoughts were still spinning in my head. What should I look for? What is happening to this house? At that moment, I remembered the old photograph again. I looked at it, now holding it in my hands. It was the same photograph that showed the place where I now lived. And again, on the back, there was a note, "Don't come back here." I began to understand that this note could be a warning. Perhaps someone had known what was going on here before and was trying to warn me. But who was this person, and why couldn't I understand what was happening? I looked at the photo and felt the cold again. Had I gone down a path from which I could not return? At that moment, I knew I was close to solving the mystery. But was this what I really wanted? Or was I now trapped in a trap from which there was no escape? Night had come again. The same cold, piercing wind, the same silent forest outside the windows, which seemed to be watching my every move. I sat in a chair, staring into space. Time dragged on here slowly, and despite the fact that I was alone, I felt that something was present in this house, next to me. This something was not visible, but I felt it constantly, like a shadow that is always near but never touches. Trying not to pay attention to these strange feelings, I closed my eyes again and tried to concentrate. I thought that if I did not pay attention, everything would disappear, but it did not. Last night had left its mark. That growing sense of dread that someone was watching me wouldn't go away. And the strangest thing was, it was becoming more and more real. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I started noticing little details that used to seem normal to me. Strange sounds, almost imperceptible, but still there. Creaks, rustles, footsteps that I couldn't explain. Especially at night, when I was trying to sleep, it seemed to me that someone was moving around the house. Sometimes I heard noises in the hallway when no one could be there. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just the wind or the creaking of old boards, but I knew that it wasn't so. The dark forest, I looked out the window and it became something frightening to me. At first I thought it was just because I was alone and loneliness was playing with my senses. But now I was sure that the forest itself was hiding something that I couldn't see, but that I felt on an intuitive level. I remembered how in the first week of living here, when I walked with Harley, everything seemed normal. The forest was just a forest and I felt its calm, but now I began to notice details that had previously escaped my attention. Strange tracks on the ground, as if someone had walked through the forest, but this was not visible at the time of the walk. In some places, the paths had been remade, but it was unclear who had done it. With each passing day, I felt more and more that what was happening around me could not be a mere coincidence. My steps became more and more cautious, as if I did not want to attract the attention of this invisible presence. And the strangest thing was that I no longer felt safe. The house became somehow alien. I constantly felt its emptiness, but at the same time I felt that it was hiding something terrible. Every night I would hear Harley start barking at nothing, at the very shadows I couldn't see. It was more than just fear. It was a desperate reaction, as if she, too, was trying to figure out what was happening. But when I tried to calm her down, she wouldn't calm down. The barking grew louder. She seemed different. Her behavior was strange, almost aggressive. I didn't know how to react. Maybe she was feeling something I couldn't understand. Maybe her instincts were right, and my attempts to ignore what was happening were only making things worse. One night, after trying to calm her down, I got up and went into the hallway to check what was causing her anxiety. I listened, but everything was quiet, too quiet. But then I heard a strange sound. It was barely noticeable, like someone was quietly walking on a wooden floor. I froze, listening, but then I realized that I could no longer stand still. I went to the door, opened it, and looked out into the darkness. The forest was completely still. Only the wind rustled softly in the branches. But there was something tense in the air. I felt something cold slide along the side of my neck, as if someone was breathing directly into my face. It was not the wind. It was something else. I abruptly closed the door and went back into the room, trying to calm down. But I couldn't calm down. My thoughts returned to that photograph, which was becoming more and more of a mystery to me. I knew that this place where I lived had its own history, and it was connected to something dark, something I couldn't understand. But that photograph was the key for me. With each passing day, with each passing hour, I felt more and more that I was not alone, and that this house and the forest were hiding much more than I wanted to know. Gradually, I began to notice more and more strange things, little details that had seemed insignificant before became important. The creaking sounds on the floor when I walked around the house, the appearance of footprints that couldn't have been left by Harley because she had never been in those places. All of this gave me a strange feeling like I was trapped, a trap that was gradually tightening, and I didn't know how to get out. Every night I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The fear wouldn't let go, and perhaps I already knew that no amount of effort would help me get rid of it. Something was here, in this house, and it was getting closer. I woke up to Harley barking again. This was more than her usual reaction to strange sounds. The barking was loud and alarming. She did not calm down, as if she sensed something terrible. I got out of bed, rubbed my eyes, and went to the window. The forest was swallowed by fog. Everything was hidden under this white blanket, and this foggy world felt like it had no end. Even the house where I was seemed to have no boundaries. The walls disappeared into this endless darkness. Harley continued to fidget, her barking becoming more and more frantic. I opened the door and stood in the hallway, trying to figure out what was making her so nervous. It was dark, and only the dim light from a nightlight in the corner provided a weak illumination. I stood up and slowly walked toward the room from which her voice was coming. When I opened the door, Harley was in the corner, staring at a point in the empty room. Her body was tense, and her tail was raised. She stood on her feet like a hunting dog who had sniffed out her prey, but there was nothing to see. I walked up to her and quietly said her name, but she didn't react. The fog outside the window was now pronounced, but there was nothing in the room that could explain her behavior. Suddenly, I felt a cold. It was so piercing that it immediately made me feel dangerous. It wasn't just the wind, but something that seemed foreign to this place was penetrating inside. I moved away from the window and went to the bookshelf to find something that could calm me down, but my gaze fell on the photograph that I had been trying to forget all this time. The same photograph, an old snapshot of the house I lived in with a man standing in the shadows. A flash of fear washed over me as I looked at it again. With each passing week, I noticed something new about it. At first, when I found it in the corner of the closet, it seemed like just an artifact, accidentally forgotten. But now, with each passing day, I felt like it was more than just a coincidence. I couldn't shake the feeling that this man in the photograph was somehow connected to the events that were happening. But what bothered me most were his eyes. He was looking straight into the camera, and there was something familiar and alien about his gaze. It was like the feeling when you meet someone you haven't seen for years, but something in their behavior reminds you of a terrible moment from the past. And this look in the photograph haunted me, making me think that this was not just a random snapshot. I went back to the window and peered out into the fog. The woods beyond the house seemed restless, as if something was moving inside them, but nothing was visible. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but something inside me made me look back again. Harley was still standing there, staring at the same spot in the corner of the room. Her body was tense, and even I could feel her tension, as if she intuitively knew something was wrong. But what worried me even more was that I heard strange sounds, creaking, as if someone was slowly moving through the house, leaving invisible footprints behind them. I tried to calm myself for a moment, but I was overcome by the feeling that I was not alone. I felt it especially acutely when I turned to leave the room and suddenly saw a shadow cross the hallway. A moment and everything returned to normal. The shadow was gone, but its presence was so tangible that I knew that I had not seen an illusion. My brain tried to find an explanation for this, but it didn't come. I tried to rationalize everything that was happening: the old house, the partitions, the creaking floors. All of this could be the result of the noise from the wind or the old structure. But despite all my attempts, I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just my fears. I wasn't alone in this house. My first thought was to try to get out and check out what was going on around me. But then it hit me. I didn't know what could be lurking in this forest, or what kind of fog was hiding what was really going on here next to me. The fear I felt wasn't just a result of loneliness. It was something real, something that was there, and I could feel it. I went back to my room, slammed the door, and looked at the photo again. It wasn't just a coincidence. I realized that the man in the picture was somehow the key to what was happening to me. I began to feel that there was more to this house than just strange sounds and empty shadows. And now I knew that I had to solve this mystery, even if it was scary. But when I looked at Harley, her eyes met mine, and I knew she felt it too. She knew, and it was so much more than I could have imagined. I woke up with a strange feeling, as if something was watching me. Before I had time to open my eyes, I could already feel this chill sliding across my skin. It wasn't just the usual chill that comes with the cool of the night. No, this one was special, as if it was penetrating inside, to the very core. The same chill that always comes before something inevitable. I opened my eyes and saw that the room was dark, but something in the air had changed, as if space itself had become compressed, disappearing and blurring at the same time. My head pounded from the recent sleep, and the silence of the night around me filled me with anxiety. Harley lay at my feet, motionless, her usually calm snores not audible. I rose from the bed and went to the window, trying to somehow make out something in this darkness. The outside world was swallowed by a thick fog, but this was not a normal morning fog. No, this was something else. It was as if the forest itself, hiding the house, was embraced by something dark and incomprehensible, and its shadows were now creeping on all sides. I looked back at Harley, who was sitting there wary as always, and I felt even more scared. This wasn't her usual behavior, where she was just paying attention to the world around her. It was more like she was waiting for something that was supposed to happen, but hadn't yet. I walked up to her, stroked her head, but she didn't react. Her gaze was fixed on a spot on the floor, as if there was something there, but I couldn't see anything. This gaze, directed at something invisible to me, made me feel that something much stranger was happening. Everything in the room seemed to change, as if the atmosphere itself had become denser. I thought that perhaps it was just my impressions, but for some reason I felt uneasy. I walked to the door and slowly opened it, hoping that everything would be fine outside, that the fog was just a natural phenomenon that would soon clear. But as soon as I stepped over the threshold, I was overcome by the feeling that I shouldn't have gone out. The forest was the same as before, but now, despite all its natural beauty, it seemed alien. The fog was firmly enveloping everything I saw, and it created the illusion that the forest and the house had merged into one, as if they had become a part of each other. I looked back, and in that instant I thought I caught a movement in the very center of the forest. It was so quick that I couldn't tell what it was exactly: a shadow slipping through the trees, or a play of light creating unusual shapes. But that feeling that something was there, it didn't leave me. I went back into the house, closed the door, and suddenly realized that Harley was now looking at me. She didn't look away, her eyes full of the same fear that I had felt when I stepped outside. I decided to check out what was going on. I didn't know what to expect, but I couldn't just sit here without knowing what was behind the fog. When I went to the window, I saw that the forest outside my house seemed alive. Yes, alive, like there was something in it that shouldn't be there, like someone was hiding in its shadows and watching my every move. I stood and watched, feeling the tension in the air. Something was wrong. I needed to get out, go into the woods, see for myself. But at the same time, I felt a pull to return to the house, to the sheltered space where nothing could disturb me. And this strange feeling, as if the forest were a living being watching me, did not leave me. With each passing minute, I felt more and more insecure. At that moment, Harley started barking again. It was the same nervous bark as the night it all started. She couldn't calm down, and I realized that she felt the same way I did. She knew. She sensed the danger in the air, and her instincts were far more advanced than my human senses. I walked up to her and noticed how her fur stood up and her eyes became even more intense. Thoughts I had tried to suppress began to surface in my mind. I wondered if the fog and strange sensations were just the effects of long hours of loneliness, fear, and nighttime stress. But part of me knew this wasn't just my imagination. This was real, and something much bigger than I could have imagined was beginning to emerge. I walked away from the window, closing it, and returned to the darkness of the room. With each step, I felt this unknown fear growing. Now, I was sure of one thing: I was not alone. And if this is not just a mind game, then I don't know how to deal with it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Even when I tried to recalibrate myself, breathing in the air as usual, trying to be rational, I couldn't shake the anxiety that was overwhelming me. The room was dark, and the shadows seemed too deep, and the sounds that were usually insignificant now seemed too loud. Everything around me was starting to feel alien. This was not an ordinary night. This was something else, something unknown, that was bothering me. I looked around again, as if checking that nothing had changed. Everything was in its place. My desk with papers, the books on the shelves, the chair where I often sat, absorbed in thought. Everything was as it should be. But this did not calm me down. I noticed how my hands began to shake, and I tried to pull myself together, so as not to give in to this anxiety. Harley was silent. Usually she was always there, ready to come to me at any moment or show interest in what was happening. But now her behavior was strange. I looked around, but she was nowhere to be seen. I looked at the bed, her favorite place, where she always slept, empty. Even her toy, which she always carried with her, was not lying on the pillow. I felt a strange anxiety. Silence filled the room, and I slowly stood up to check where she was. I was halfway to the door when I suddenly heard a light sound, like someone was walking on a wooden floor. I froze, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It was vague, barely distinguishable, but loud enough to make me hold my breath. I walked up to the door, carefully opening it and peering out into the hallway. All was quiet, but there was a strange, cold dampness in the air, as if a fresh rain had just fallen. I took a few steps forward and stopped at one of the doors. There, in the corner, I noticed movement. It was Harley. She sat still as a stone statue, staring at something I couldn't see. Her body was tense, her fur was slightly raised, and her eyes were so focused that she seemed to be seeing something I couldn't see. I approached her, carefully sitting down next to her. She didn't react, her gaze still fixed on one spot. Suddenly her paws wobbled, and she took a few steps back, holding her head low. It was a sign that she felt a threat that was inaudible to me. I tried to calm her down, but I felt how the fear that had seemed abstract before now settled in me too. This fear was so real that it seemed as if it was wrapping itself around me, squeezing me tighter with each passing second. "What do you see?" I almost whispered, but I knew there would be no answer. Harley couldn't speak. She could only feel, but her behavior was a clear signal. What she saw was out of this world. My hand instinctively reached for her head, to stroke it and try to bring it back to normal. But as soon as my fingers touched her fur, I felt a shudder run through her body. She didn't want me to stay with her. She jumped away from me, as if I was a danger to her. It was strange. We had been together for so long and I had never seen her like this. My head began to spin. My own fears and anxieties intertwined with her behavior. I felt something coming, but I didn't know what. I looked again at the door leading to the street. The woods behind the house were as dark as ever, but now the fog seemed thicker. I saw something moving in the fog, but too fast to catch the eye. It was not an animal, not a person, but something that defied explanation. Something that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge. With each passing moment, I felt the space around me shrink. The walls seemed to be getting closer, the air thicker. The fear that was gripping me was not ordinary. It was not just the feeling of uncertainty. It was the knowledge that I was standing on the brink of something I could not understand, but which I had to face. I knew that running away would not work. Time, like space, was irrelevant here. I looked back at Harley, who was standing next to me, still looking at the same spot where I had noticed the movement. I realized that she wasn't just waiting for something. She was ready for something. Maybe even knew that we would soon meet whatever was lurking in these woods. I could feel my fear rising. We were here. We were in the middle of this, and we were about to face something that lay beyond what I could understand. Story 2, as far as I can remember, I have always seen things that were not there and heard things that others could not. It started from my earliest years, when I was still little. At that time, I did not know what was happening to me. Everything seemed normal. Some said that I imagined too much, but I was a child, and my imagination was alive. But later, when I grew older, it became clear that not always what I saw could be explained as a figment of the imagination. I went to see a psychiatrist when I was about 10 years old because my parents were starting to worry. All the strange voices I was hearing and shadows moving around the corners of the room were starting to seem abnormal to them. When I was diagnosed, I didn't really care. I didn't feel like there was anything wrong with me. I was just me, a person who saw the world a little differently than everyone else. But my parents insisted on treatment. The psychiatrist said I was suffering from an extremely hyperactive brain that was perhaps taking in too much information. He prescribed me some pills that were supposed to help, and they did. At some point, I began to feel these hallucinations receding, and I finally felt normal, like everyone else. But to be honest, they never went away completely. They just got quieter. What had once been loud and vivid was now barely audible whispers in the background of my thoughts. I continued to live my life like everyone else, but there was this weird part of me that couldn't quite go away. But a few nights ago, I woke up late, very late. It was too late, and I felt like I had trouble getting up. It was my habit to go to bed too late. And then, when you sleep during the day, you become helpless, unable to break free from the influence of sleep. And then I heard it, a creak on the window. At first I thought it was another hallucination. I just rolled over, tried to fall asleep again, ignoring the sound. I knew that if I tried not to think about it, it would go away. It was my salvation, and I tried to believe that everything was fine. But the sound continued to haunt me. The same creaking, the same unbearably quiet but constant sound that began to accumulate tension in itself. It was something unusual. I realized that I could not continue to lie calmly, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I got out of bed and walked to the nightstand where my pills were. My body felt heavy, as if I was dragging some kind of weight behind me. All this fatigue was my constant companion. It felt like I was floating with each step, as if the space around me had become liquid. I took a few pills, more than I should have. I swallowed them quickly, without thinking about the consequences. I knew I needed to calm down. I needed to get rid of this unpleasant sound that was bothering me. These drugs always helped me forget. They created an emptiness inside that calmed me down. I went back to bed, closing my eyes. My eyelids were heavy, and my thoughts were slowly dissolving into the void. I was immersed in a fog that covered me like a blanket, but that sound, the creaking, it didn't go away. It wasn't just a creaking anymore. It felt like someone was trying to open my window, slowly, carefully, as if testing how much it would give in. But it was impossible. My windows were always closed, locked. I knew it. At some point, I couldn't ignore the sound anymore. My mind started working faster than my body. Fear was rising inside me. What if this wasn't just a hallucination? What if it was something else? I tried to make myself believe that this was just another delusion caused by the pills I'd taken, but the feeling was too real. My heart started pounding harder than usual. I got out of bed again, now in a panic. I went to the window, which was at an angle, and began to carefully lift the blinds. That moment when I saw him, it still stands out in my mind, even though several days have passed. The creature, or rather, something that looked like a creature, stood in the darkness, next to my window. Its outline was strange, wrong. It looked like a person, but something was wrong. It was as if it had been put together in the wrong proportions, as if someone had taken a person and mixed up the blueprints. I couldn't see it fully, It was too scary, but I caught a glimpse of its face, a face that had no human features, only distortions. It was frozen, as if it were hiding. I felt my stomach tighten with fear. Then, before I could do anything, the creature raised its hand, skinny and bony, and in one motion shattered the glass of my window. Glass flew everywhere, and I felt reality begin to crumble around me. My cat, who was always by my side, jumped on the creature, as if trying to protect me, but it was terrible. The creature grabbed him, bit him in the stomach, and blood and guts splattered all over the floor. I couldn't watch, couldn't understand what was happening. I was confused. I ran, but I couldn't move. My legs felt paralyzed. I felt glass cutting into my hand. I couldn't scream. I couldn't say a word. But I knew I had to leave, that if I stayed, it would be the end. When I finally managed to break free from my body, feeling as if it had ceased to obey me, I wandered into the bathroom, closing the door behind me. I had only one goal: to hide, to maintain some kind of safety. I sat there for several minutes, trying to comprehend what was happening, but every glance at the dark corners of the bathroom only increased my tension. I was in a panic, but I needed to collect myself in order to figure out what to do next. It all seemed so unreal. How could I believe that these were just hallucinations? Was my brain so unstable that it could create such a terrifying image? But the horror I experienced was too real. I couldn't justify what I saw, and even with all the fear that paralyzed me, I couldn't stop the flow of thoughts. Everything was happening too fast. I tried to figure out what to do now, but even in the bathroom it was cold and the air was heavy. I remembered his face reflected in the glass. A face that wasn't human, but it was there. It was looking at me, and I could feel it. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. It wasn't just an image or a vision. It was real. My mind raced from one thought to another, but I couldn't find an answer. I felt my fingers tightening and my muscles tense. I tried to relax, but the fear and anxiety wouldn't let go. I was alone, but not alone. Something was watching me. It was a strange feeling, like I was being watched in every corner. I decided to check the door. I approached it carefully without making unnecessary movements. The door seemed to be locked, but I still lifted its handle. Strange, it wasn't locked. I felt something inside me begin to squeeze, like a premonition. And then I heard a voice. It was his voice. I would never forget that sound. A voice that seemed familiar but somehow distorted, like a sound recorded backwards, pure evil. It called to me, softly, almost pleadingly. "Daniel, please come out." It was my father. I recognized his voice, but it sounded so unnatural, so distorted. There was something sick about it, something unnatural. I couldn't understand what it meant. I was sure I couldn't trust that voice. It was something I hadn't heard before. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to hide from the sound, so that it wouldn't penetrate me, fill every cell. There was no certainty in that voice that I was used to hearing. This was not the father I knew. I didn't know what to do. Answer? Open the door? I knew I shouldn't anyway, but the fear was too strong. The voice kept coming, and with each repetition it became more and more distorted. I felt a tightness in my chest, a cold sweat running down my back. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Everything inside me was clenched. I stood there motionless, as if trapped by the sound, and there it was, the knocking. At first it was faint, barely audible, but soon it grew louder. I felt the walls around me shaking. It was like thunder, but inside my house, inside my body. It pounded, like something was trying to break in. I tried to cover my ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate right through me. It was too much. It all felt real. The knocking became more and more insistent. The walls, the floor, the whole room began to vibrate under the pressure of these blows. I felt how part of the door began to shake. It was already creaking, and I knew that I could not stay in this place for long. Time seemed to flow out, disappear, and only a feeling of hopelessness remained. "Daniel, come out, I need to talk to you." His voice was becoming more and more distorted. There was nothing human about it. I felt the air around me heating up, as if there was a fire in the room. Then the door began to creak. Splinters of wood flew in all directions. I saw it breaking, as if someone was trying to rip it out of its hinges. Bang, bang, bang. It all sounded like a hammer hitting my mind. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Fear paralyzed me, not allowing me to think or act. When the door broke and the hand came out, I felt the adrenaline pumping through every cell. It wasn't just a vision. I felt that hand, that cold, twisted gesture, something sinister and inhuman reaching for me. I squeezed my eyes shut, but I still saw it. I still heard it. "Let me in" was not just a word, it was a cry of pain, pain that I felt without wanting to feel. My hands were shaking and the air felt heavy, like I was drowning in the sound. I had to go, I had to get out, or it would get me. It was too late, but I had to run. I didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been only a few seconds, or it could have been an eternity. Time ceased to matter as the door gave way completely and shattered into splinters. I stood in the dark bathroom, trapped, feeling desperate, as if I was about to be grabbed by the scruff of the neck. And this thing that was breaking through the door seemed to be about to reach me. I ran. I wasn't thinking. I didn't realize what I was doing as I leaped through the broken door and ran down the hallway. I could see only dark spots, light and shadow shifting in corners, footsteps echoing in empty rooms. The space around me was distorted. The walls seemed to be moving, and every step I took echoed in my head. As I ran, it felt like I wasn't just running through my house, I was running through a maze that was becoming more and more confusing, more and more threatening. My home, which I had once known so well, was now unrecognizable. With every turn, I felt the fear intensify, as if I was being pursued from every corner. My ears were ringing, but I couldn't afford to look back. I knew that if I did, it would all be over. My steps were getting faster, but it felt like I was not moving. I was skipping steps, sliding across the floor, feeling the dust under my fingernails digging into my skin. There was only one question in my head: where should I go? Finally, I reached the door that led to the basement. My mind told me that there I would find some shelter, some safety. I opened the door and walked down the stairs, feeling the cold from the stone steps. The basement was dark, full of shadows and old things. That damp smell, that unbearable cold, it seemed alive, ready to swallow me whole. I closed the door behind me, trying to do it as quietly as possible, but the sound of it closing echoed throughout the room. In the darkness that swallowed me, I felt the air become thick, heavy. I knew I shouldn't stay here, but at the same time I couldn't let myself go. I realized that at this moment, any shadow could become a threat. I froze listening. A strange sound, like something rustling in the corner. It was not the sound of life. It was the sound of something that should be dead. Rustles, whispers, and then I felt it. The creature I had imagined was not one, but several. It was everywhere. I started running through the basement, but they were chasing me. The shadows were spreading, and each of them seemed alive. I stopped abruptly, remembering the old door in the far corner of the basement. It was always locked, and I had never been interested in what was behind it. But now I felt like this was my only chance. My hands frantically reached for the door. I didn't know what would be beyond it, but I couldn't allow myself to return to the surface. Something about this basement was familiar. I opened the door and stepped into the unknown. When I entered the small room behind the door, the air was cold. The walls were covered in moss, and the floor was littered with rotting scraps of wood. There was no light, only darkness and the smell of age. I felt even more isolated than before. This corner of the house seemed forgotten by time. I could imagine no one had entered here for decades. Time stood still in this room. I heard it again. That same creaking sound, familiar but no less frightening. The creature was moving through the house, and I knew it wouldn't leave me alone. My nerves couldn't take it anymore. I peered into the dark corners, trying to discern something, but I couldn't see anything. My hands were sweating, my heart was beating so hard in my chest that I thought it would burst out. I kept walking, stepping carefully, not making unnecessary movements. The longer I stayed in this place, the more I began to feel that something was wrong. I was not alone. The creature was nearby, and this feeling did not go away. When I turned around, I felt a cold hand touch my neck. It was real. I tried to resist, but the force was too great. The creature squeezed me, and I felt it pull me into a dark corner, into the deepest shadow. I couldn't scream. I couldn't fight back. The creature was on my shoulder again, with its twisted face and cold eyes that seemed to burn my soul. I couldn't move, but despite the fear that filled me, I knew one thing: I couldn't give up. Chapter 4. Shadows that come to life. I didn't know how much time had passed. The entity squeezing my body seemed to be digging into me like sharp needles. My breathing was interrupted, and I felt like I was short of air. I tried to break free, but I couldn't. All my movements were too slow. My muscles seemed to refuse to work. The temperature around me was icy, and my heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to burst. I felt like I was being pulled into the abyss again, and this feeling was unbearably scary. I remember struggling to move as the creature pulled me deeper into the shadows, where I could not accidentally enter. My mind tried to find a way out, some way to escape, but every corner, every wall, seemed part of this nightmare now. I heard something rustling in the darkness, something hidden and alien to this world. I felt the walls closing in on me, and my legs lost the ability to move. I no longer knew where the end of this room was, where the walls were, and where the emptiness was. Everything merged into one crazy mixture, as if I found myself in some space that violated all the laws of reality. There was no time, no space, only this horror, dark creatures, rustlings and voices that sounded like an echo in my mind. Every moment, every sound seemed dangerous, and I had no hope of salvation. I froze, trying to collect my thoughts, holding back the fear that was overwhelming me. I didn't know who I was now, what I had become, this pathetic person who couldn't get out of his own reality, his own shadow. But I had to move, I had to find a way out. And then, at that moment, I heard something. A small sound, almost imperceptible, like someone knocking on the wall. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't something scary or alien. It was different. Maybe it was a chance. Maybe it was just my imagination. But I had no choice. I turned around and looked into the dark corners. There was something strange about this place. I realized that this was not just an abandoned room. This was the place where they were born, where they existed. I could not tear my eyes away from the dark corners. I felt that all this was not just a hallucination, not just psychosis. This was real, like a physical threat. I took a step back, trying to get back to the door, but my movements were slow, almost uncoordinated. It was as if something was holding me back, holding me in place. I turned, ready to run again, but there was a dark figure standing in front of me, like a silhouette. It was so dark that it was hard to see. I couldn't make out a face, couldn't figure out what it was. Something inside me screamed, "Stay away." I felt my body tense, my heart freeze in my chest. It was like a survival instinct awakening, but the creature didn't move. It stood there like a shadow, and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with this shadow that led all life, everything I had ever known. Suddenly, it took a step toward me, and I felt a chill penetrate me to the very bones. I tried to take a step back, but my legs were buckling. I no longer knew what was happening to reality. Everything around me was becoming strange, alien. My head was spinning, and I realized that I was losing touch with this world again. The creature continued to move towards me, and I felt it getting closer. There was no human or animal quality to its dark form. It was something else. A creature of shadow and night, something that defied logic, that had no explanation. But suddenly it stopped, and everything around me became silent. There was no rustling, no sounds. Only emptiness. I didn't know what it was, but I felt my body being freed from some heavy burden. I realized that the creature didn't want to kill me. It was searching for something in me. Maybe it wanted to break me, so that I would understand I was no longer the master of my life. I felt that pressure on my chest disappear again. I knew I had no time to waste. This was my only window of escape, my only chance. I felt despair wash over me, like something was taking hold of my soul. But I couldn't stop. I jumped up, not feeling the pain from my wounded body, and rushed towards the exit again. The walls of the basement began to disappear, dissolving into thin air. This space, it was starting to collapse. I ran, not knowing where, not realizing what was happening. I knew only one thing. If I didn't escape, if I didn't get out of here, I would stay here forever. And then, when I was almost at the exit, I heard one last scream that went through the entire void. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling that filled the entire space. I knew that maybe this was the end. When I ran out of the basement, the air on the surface was unusually fresh, as if I had just left a dark, stuffy world and returned to life. My legs were weak, but I kept moving anyway, without looking back, without thinking about what I had left behind. The shadows that had followed me in the basement did not disappear, and although I was already upstairs, in the complete darkness of the night, the feeling that I was not alone did not leave me. Darkness was everywhere, and no matter how many times I looked back, it seemed as if the shadows were following me, sliding next to me. I knew I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave the house, get somewhere far away, somewhere where I could escape what was haunting me. I didn't know if it was the creatures, the shadows, or my own hallucination, but I was sure that this house was no longer what it seemed. It was something else. The wind whistled through the trees, and I walked toward the exit, toward the road, toward the light. But the further I walked, the more I felt the space around me becoming more and more distorted. I ran along a familiar path, but every step felt wrong, and the farther I went from home, the darker the forests around me became. Leaves rustled under my fingernails, and the branches of the trees seemed to begin to cross in my path, as if the trees themselves were trying to hold me back. I stopped, and then I felt it again, the cold. It was coming from somewhere inside me. It wasn't a physical cold, not the kind you feel in the air. It was something internal, as if some icy gaze was penetrating right into my soul, squeezing it. I looked around. No, it was not a simple feeling. I was not mistaken. I saw a shadowy figure appear near the trees. A silhouette as dark as the night itself. It moved smoothly, as if dissolving into the darkness, but there was something inhuman in its movements. It was not just a shadow, but something that did not belong to this world. I started to walk back, but before I could take more than a few steps, I heard a sound behind me, like a tree breaking under the weight of something huge. I turned around, but the creature was gone. I didn't know what to do. Did I think I was being followed? Or was it just a mental concussion that was making me lose touch with reality? I started to walk back into the house. Maybe I was wrong, maybe I was too scared, but I needed to get back to where it all started, where I could understand what was really going on. When I got back to my house, it looked like it always did, old, ominous, and closed to everyone. I walked up to the door, but before I entered, I felt a strange sensation, as if someone was watching me from inside. Everything in the house seemed silent, but I knew that there was something hidden behind the silence. I carefully opened the door. The shadows inside seemed even thicker than before. The strange feeling that had been haunting me came over me again. It was something that could not be explained. I knew that the house itself would not let me find the answers. I went up to the second floor and entered my room. Everything was the same, but for some reason I felt that the space inside the room was different, changed. The room was similar to the one I remembered, but not completely. The decor, the furniture, everything seemed slightly crooked, disrupting the usual perception. The whole air around me was permeated with this feeling of strangeness. I walked over to my desk where some documents were lying and noticed that one of them was upside down. I picked it up. On its surface was only one strange drawing that I couldn't understand. There were no words, no images, only a line broken, with several branches, reminiscent of intertwining paths. Suddenly I realized that this wasn't just a drawing, it was a message. Maybe it was a clue that could help me understand what was happening in this house, what was happening to the reality around me. I felt everything around me begin to darken again. My eyes couldn't comprehend what was happening, but I knew that in that moment, Reality was beginning to change, breaking and falling apart. There was something more, something deeper than I could comprehend. I stood in the room, surrounded by this darkness, and felt every movement become slower, as if time was compressing. My thoughts were confused, and I could not understand what this meant. The sound coming from somewhere deep inside the house was getting louder with each passing moment. I felt the walls of this place begin to move, as if the house itself was alive, and its insides were beginning to change. I knew something terrible was waiting for me, but I couldn't stop. I followed this feeling, step by step, looking for answers in this place where reality and illusion intersected. I found myself in darkness again, and this time it was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on what had changed, but everything around me seemed warped, distorted. At first I thought it was just my fatigue, that my mind was exhausted and unable to process reality. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was something more. The shadows, which had once been abstract spots in the corners, were now something alive. I could discern their forms. They moved, slid across the floor, stretched across the walls. I noticed that they began to change, as if materializing something hidden, something that should not be visible. In one shadow I discerned the outline of a person, and in another, something that looked more like an animal. Their movements were fluid, as if they were part of something alive. I felt the coldness creeping through me again. The gaze of those shadows was hypnotic. I tried to turn away, but I couldn't. It was as if they were pulling me towards them, forcing me to sink into their embrace, into their cold and unknown reality. I knew I shouldn't look at them. I knew it was dangerous, but my body didn't seem to listen to me. It kept going, as if I was under the influence of some force. I came closer, and the shadow figures began to become more distinct. They moved with such ease that they seemed not to touch the floor, but their presence was too real. I saw one of the shadows take the form of a man standing in front of me, and although I could not see his face, I knew that this man was familiar. It was a strange feeling, as if he was a part of me. I couldn't remember who it was, but something about its shape reminded me of something I had experienced as a child. I remembered an old photograph of me with someone who was important to me. I tried to reach out to touch that shadow, but at that moment it disappeared, dissolving into thin air. I stood in an empty room. Everything around me was too quiet, and I felt my own footsteps echoing off the walls. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the space around me was getting tighter, like I was trapped. With every step I took, I felt an unimaginable weight coming over me. I didn't know how to get out of this labyrinth, and what if I didn't make it in time? What if these shadows were just the beginning? My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't control my movements anymore. I looked around again and noticed that the figures that had been on the sides had begun to gather in the center of the room. They weren't angry, but their presence created a tension that was impossible to ignore. I took a step forward, but then I felt one of the shadows grow thick and dense. It reached out to me, grabbing my leg, and I knew it wasn't going to let go. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a shadow that seemed to be consuming everything around it, including me. I felt myself being pulled into the unknown, into an endless cold that shouldn't exist in this world. I screamed, but the sound was unbearably muffled. I was voiceless, as if this shadow had engulfed not only my body but my mind as well. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that if I didn't find a way to get rid of this shadow, I would lose not only myself, but everything I had ever held dear. I glanced back and saw the other shadows begin to rise, merging with each other. They were becoming something bigger, something that wasn't connected to this world. I felt everything around me begin to blur, reality losing its outline. I couldn't continue to stand. I started to move, not knowing where or how. I tried to escape from this nightmare, but as soon as I moved forward, the shadows became more and more insistent, trying to pull me back. And then I realized I was no longer just a person. I was part of this world, part of their world. I was with them. I took the last step, desperately trying to break free, but I didn't know what was waiting for me beyond that step. When I stepped into the dark void, there was no pain or fear. Instead, I felt a strange sensation, as if something was being stretched and compressed at the same time, as if the space around me was stretched to infinity, and I was at the very center of this chaos. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed into another dimension, into a world where the rules of reality did not apply. I stood in a place that was both familiar and alien. I found myself in a timeless void. There was nothing but darkness, which seemed to swallow up even the faintest traces of light. Everything around me seemed to be covered in a haze. In this place, I could not perceive distances or determine where one part of space ended and another began. Everything merged into one non-existent whole. I tried to move, but my feet didn't seem to touch the ground. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten here, and it didn't matter. I knew I had to find a way out now. But as soon as I took a step, silhouettes began to appear before me. They emerged gradually, as if from the darkness itself. Light, translucent, these figures moved, but not like living beings. They were more like shadows that take shape in response to your gaze. I stopped and looked at them. Some of the figures seemed familiar, but I couldn't quite place them. One of them was like me, with the same features but strange distortions in its appearance. I felt like this figure wasn't me, but at the same time it was a part of me. It was like meeting myself, but in a different form, in another dimension. The figure stepped towards me, and I froze. I couldn't move. Everything was happening so fast that I didn't have time to comprehend what was happening. The silhouette took another step and suddenly disappeared. I tried to turn around, but I found myself in a different place. Everything around me had changed. This time I found myself among trees I didn't remember. They weren't the same trees I had seen before in real life. They were dark, their branches spreading like snakes, and their leaves looked like they were burnt. With every step I took, the darkness grew thicker and the world around me became more and more undefined. I felt myself slowly losing touch with reality. My thoughts became confused. I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't know where I was, but I felt like this place shouldn't exist in the world I was used to. I kept walking, not realizing that I was in any other state. With each passing minute, I became less and less aware. My senses became less precise. I was sure that this was just a nightmare, but I could not wake up. Suddenly, I noticed a light beginning to break through the darkness. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I knew it was a path. I walked towards it, without asking myself questions, without thinking about what it could be. I had to move. I couldn't stay here. With each step, the light grew brighter, and I felt the pressure inside me release. However, as I got closer, I realized that the light was not just light. It was a mirror, a huge mirror that stood right in the center of this strange world. It was dark and crackling, as if it itself was alive, sinister. I looked at its surface and suddenly realized that the reflection I saw was not mine. It was something else, something frightening. I knew that I could not trust this reflection, that it could be a deception, but I could not tear myself away. It attracted me, as if beckoning me into the very abyss. And then I felt something cold touch my hand. I looked down and saw that the shadows I had seen before were now part of this world. They had merged with reality, and I could no longer tell where the shadows ended and reality itself began. I was part of this emptiness, part of this space that defied logic. But then I heard it. At first it was like a whisper, then a loud movement, as if someone or something was next to me. I turned around, and in the reflection of the mirror I saw it, a figure standing right behind me. It was the same silhouette I had seen before, but now it was inseparable from me. We were the same. I was him, he was me, and it was all the same. I realized with horror that this was a moment of transformation. I was not just an observer, I was becoming part of what was happening, and now I could not go back. Story 3. The air off Lake Erie always felt different at night, somehow heavier, carrying secrets on the damp wind. Even now, as I stood at the window of my little house, I could feel that night breath seeping into every pore of my skin, making me shiver. It was strange. The familiar woodsy scent couldn't hide the sour tension in the air, as if something was about to happen but hadn't yet. This strange sense of heaviness filled me, as if I stood on the edge of some abyss with no idea what lay beyond. The little cabin we rented for the summer had always felt like a cozy refuge. Even with the peeling paint on the walls, the worn furniture, and the slightly slanted roof, it felt safe. I guess that was what I needed after all the stress that had filled my last year. The arguments with friends, my parents, the worries about the future, the strange silence that was always around, even when I tried to fill it with voices, sounds, actions. But today was different. Mom and Dad came home from the store earlier than I expected. They are always so busy, always in a hurry, and I am often alone with my sister. Lily, the youngest, was in her room, as usual, all in her books and her games, completely absorbed in a world that had nothing to do with the present. Mom and I were sitting down to dinner, which was, as usual, simple: fried chicken, potatoes, some vegetables, an ordinary meal for an ordinary night. But this time, things didn't go as usual. I don't remember what exactly caused the argument. Maybe I didn't answer correctly. Maybe it was something about grades, as always. Or maybe it was just the fatigue that builds up day after day, month after month. My mother and I started arguing. She said something about my friends, about how I should be more careful, and I responded that she just didn't understand. This conflict, it was so empty, so unnecessary. Like a slippery crack that suddenly appeared in the middle of something that once seemed reliable. I screamed something that wasn't even a word, more of a lunge, an unconscious attack. And as always, we both fell silent. Mom always went to her room after an argument, as if she had disappeared, and I was always left in this empty house, filling it with my own loneliness. At that moment, I ran to my room, slamming the door so hard that the sound echoed in the silence of the house. I poured anger and frustration onto my pillow, feeling how hard it was to breathe. The light from my phone screen only increased the pressure rolling over me. I tried not to think about the words, but they continued to float in my head like lumps of mud, giving me no peace. I don't know how much time passed, but suddenly I heard it. At first it was a faint sound, barely audible, like noise coming from the bathroom. The gagging sounds, strong and guttural, were coming through the thick door. It was Mom. I froze immediately, trying to understand what was happening. Mom wasn't sick, she wasn't ill, or at least she never showed it. It was strange. She was always so strong, so sure of herself, despite everything. I sat still, only slightly aware of the sound growing louder. My anger, which had been bubbling over a moment ago, was now swallowed up by anxiety. I didn't know what to do. I stood up, swaying slightly on my feet, and walked to the door. I stood there for a few seconds, not daring to knock, not daring to break the silence. Finally, I carefully raised my hand and knocked. "Awake, Mama?" was breathed out with such anxiety that it seemed to absorb all my strength. I waited, but in response there was only silence, stretching, sliding around me, not allowing me to breathe. It was frightening, unsettling, as if the room itself were dead. Then I heard her voice from behind the door. It was even, calm, but somehow unnatural. "I'm fine, dear," it said. It wasn't her usual way of speaking, not the voice I was used to. It was dry, as if it didn't stay in one place, but simply moved through the air, touching nothing. And then a pause, a long, drawn-out pause. "I feel much better now." I didn't answer. A feeling of unease began to creep slowly across my skin, but I didn't know what to do with it. I stepped back, but the anxiety remained, clinging to my consciousness, not giving me peace. Then I went back to my bed, but I couldn't sleep. Strange thoughts kept spinning in my head, as if something elusive and unclear wouldn't let me go. I turned on my side, trying to throw it all out of my head, but when I closed my eyes, I seemed to hear a knock. It was quiet, but insistent. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the hallway. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard that I even felt the pulsation echoing in my throat. I couldn't believe it could be. I couldn't believe that the knock was coming from my mother. I slowly lifted the blanket and stood up. Opening the door just a little, I peered into the hallway. The moonlight pierced the dark windows, casting long shadows. In the darkness, I saw her. Mom was standing right at Lily's door, her head bowed, her forehead pounding the wood, inexorably, rhythmically. Knock, knock, knock. She kept doing it, as if something was forcing her. And then I realized that this was not normal. I felt the world around me shake, as if something invisible had changed in it. I stood in the hallway, unable to move. My mother continued to pound her forehead against the door, making the same strange sounds, as if she had become part of the rhythm. This was not like her. Once she had been cheerful and full of life, ready to comfort and support, but now here was a woman who was losing herself, like sand slipping through her fingers. I could only watch, unsure of what to do. I approached her slowly, as if each step might disturb something important, something fragile. My hand instinctively reached for her shoulder, to touch her, to try to wake her. But when my fingers almost touched the fabric of her dress, my mother turned her head sharply, and I met her eyes. There was nothing in their depths except emptiness. Her gaze was empty, implacable, like a deep, bottomless black abyss. There was no fear, no pain, only a complete absence of any human essence. I pulled my hand away, but I could not tear my eyes away from those eyes. It seemed as if they were looking through me, not at me. It was so strange that my fingers trembled, and I felt the cold grip my body. "Mama?" I whispered again, and my voice sounded helpless and weak in the silence. But she didn't answer. Her eyes didn't change. She stood there like a statue, and I felt something unknown, invisible, enveloping me. My heart was beating faster and faster. I couldn't understand what was happening. Suddenly she started moving, but it didn't seem like a normal movement. It was like her body was moving by inertia, uncontrollably, as if she wasn't fully conscious. I took a step back, not knowing what to do, and suddenly I heard the floors in the house creak, as if someone else was walking. My eyes darted around the room, but I couldn't see anyone except my mother. I turned in panic and ran toward Lily's room. My footsteps echoed as I rushed inside, but what I saw literally crashed into me. Lily's bed was empty. I immediately rushed to the window, but it was dark outside, only the rain pounding the glass. Lily was gone. She was gone. My heart jumped and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Where is she? Why isn't she here? At that moment, I didn't understand what was happening. All I knew was that something very scary was nearby, and it was gaining strength, and I couldn't stop it. My fingers froze in midair as I tried to scream, but there was no sound in my throat. Everything around was silent, like a dead world. I walked back into the hallway, running into my mother again. She was still standing there, in the same place, still looking at me expressionlessly. There was no fear, no emotion, just some kind of eerie emptiness. And in that moment, I realized this was not my mother. This was something else, something that had taken her form, something that, like a virus, had pushed the real personality out of her. My hands began to shake, but I continued to stand, unable to take a step. I remembered something. Ghosts, entities that could change appearance, take people away. I had heard these stories before, but they always seemed like something far away, from the world of fantasy and horror. I never thought that this could happen to me. But now it was here, and it was not fiction. Suddenly I heard a rustling sound behind me, and turning around, I saw a figure approaching us, a man in dark clothes, with bloody hands. But I couldn't figure out exactly who it was. His head was down, and his body was moving in a strange, unnatural way, as if he were not a person, but a doll that someone was pulling on strings. I had neither the strength nor the courage to move. I knew this man wasn't alive. I saw his eyes glowing with an empty fire, and his movements seemed mechanical, like a robot trying to find a target. Run. That voice sounded in my head again. It was alien, not mine. It was like a hint, but I couldn't figure out where it came from. I ran for the door, grabbing an old bag, barely thinking about what was in it, and ran out into the hallway. Fear gripped me in the darkness, but I couldn't stop. I ran for the exit, not knowing where I was running. My legs carried me on their own, as if something outside was carrying me. I knew that if I didn't run now, if I wasn't faster, I would never see this house again. When I ran out into the street, Everything around me was engulfed in darkness. The only light came from a dim lantern near the house. It was like a nightmare, something completely alien to reality. But reality was still here, and it was terrible. I ran without looking back, trying to get out of this nightmare. But ahead, in the darkness, something moved again. It was something hidden in the shadows. I froze, but I could no longer turn around. I had nowhere to go. I stood there, as if the world around me had frozen. Holding my breath, I tried to make out a figure in the darkness, but the more I tried to focus, the more the figure blurred, becoming part of the night. My hand instinctively clenched into a fist, as if trying to hold reality in place, to maintain my connection to this world. But each breath became heavier, and my body was paralyzed by a sense of invisible danger. The darkness was so thick that it seemed alive. There was not a single rustle or sound in the night. Even the wind that usually rustled in the leaves had died down. And then I heard it, quiet, almost imperceptible steps. They were like a whisper, barely touching the ear, but nevertheless I felt them in every cell of my body. It could not be anyone I knew. I was alone. No one was nearby. I turned, trying to peer into the dark corners, but saw nothing but emptiness. The fear that had gripped me from the start was now becoming reality. What had seemed invisible and inexplicable was already catching up with me. Suddenly, I felt something touch my leg. I screamed and jumped back, but under my nails there remained the sensation of something sliding. It was not real. It was like the world was moving apart around me, revealing incomprehensible depths. The shadows seemed closer, they seemed to grow, to expand in the darkness, and I understood that it was not just the wind or the animals, it was something else. Something had come for me. I rushed to the side, without thinking, without reflecting. My legs carried me to a place where I could no longer think. My consciousness was completely consumed by fear, and at that moment I forgot about the world that had once been my home. There were no thoughts or memories in my head. Everything was consumed by one thing: to run, to escape, not to look back. Suddenly, I felt something hard under my foot break. It was a wooden floor, which I literally ran through, not noticing that I had reached the destroyed part of the yard. I was thrown up, and I found myself on the ground. My hand touched the cold surface, and I heard some kind of sound, as if something very large was moving in the darkness. It was several times stronger than that rustle of steps. I raised my head, feeling how hard it was to breathe. Gnarled and cold hands pulled me from the ground. The shadows did not let go. I felt their breath close, and then I saw it. Somewhere in the distance, in the very center of this nightmare, a figure appeared. It was barely visible, but every movement emitted abnormal light, dim and intense. I could not understand who it was. It was like a face, but not quite. It was a shadow, growing out of the night itself, and it was looking at me as if it was waiting for something. But what? I screamed, trying to get up, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I couldn't move. It was like a nightmare, where the body doesn't obey. And suddenly I understood this wasn't just a figure. This was something much older and more powerful. Something that everyone knew, but that no one wanted to meet. I tried to stand again. My arms moved, trying to find support, but all I could feel were dark lines stretching from me to this creature, as if the shadow itself was wrapping itself around me. And at that moment I heard it, that strange whisper in my head again. It was something strange that couldn't be part of my thought, but at the same time it sounded like a voice that couldn't belong to anyone alive. Run. I couldn't understand who told me that, but the sensations were so vivid that I could almost believe in the reality of that whisper. But when I looked at the figure, it took a step forward, and the light disappeared. It became even darker, but I could feel it approaching. My hand clenched into a fist, and I tried to stand up, despite the strength leaving me. Fear swirled in my head, but at some point that fear turned to despair. Whatever it was faster than me. I heard the figure walking, the darkness creaking. It was like the sound of the end approaching. I felt the thought running through my head, maybe I can't get out anymore. Maybe I'll stay here forever. But without realizing how I made the final leap, I jumped into the darkness, somewhere into an unfamiliar space. My legs gave out, and I fell into the void, finding myself again in this vicious circle of fear. The shadows did not let go. I felt my legs slowly losing strength. It was as if they refused to obey me, and I began to feel my body becoming part of the strange space I found myself in. Every step I took seemed unnatural, as if I was moving not on the ground but on something soft and indefinite. The darkness around me was thick and heavy, almost tangible, and it seemed to suppress all living things, not giving the slightest chance for salvation. I couldn't understand how I had gotten here. My thoughts were fuzzy like broken glass, and my memories were blurry in my head, leaving no clear picture. My entire life seemed like a distant echo now, and I couldn't keep my focus on what had happened before this moment. All I knew was that I was here, in this place, and something strange was happening with every step I took. The dark outlines of space seemed endless. I could not see the end, and every glance forward only increased the feeling that I was no longer in control of my movement. I could not turn back, and I had no choice but to move forward, hoping for something to happen. But nothing happened, only darkness, which consumed me more and more. Every step became more difficult, and with every movement I felt myself losing touch with reality. There was no time in this place, no sense of space, only an endless, motionless darkness in which I sank like a swamp. I tried to pause, to stop, to comprehend what was happening, but the air around me was so heavy that I could neither breathe nor think. Everything seemed distorted. I kept moving, having no other choice. At one point, I thought I saw a light, faint, dim, but real. My gaze froze. It was so close that I could almost feel its warmth, but the closer I got, the further it moved away. I didn't understand what this light was, but it beckoned to me, and I almost forgot about everything else. It was my only hope. My steps became faster. It seemed to me that this was the exit, that I would now cross the line of light and find myself at the other end of this strange place. But with each step the light grew dimmer, and suddenly I realized that I was not approaching it, but on the contrary, moving away. The feeling of disappointment came to me instantly like a blow. I froze in place, not understanding what was happening, and suddenly everything around me became even more eclipsed. The dark void filled the space again. I felt every corner of this place penetrate me, as if it were alive, as if the space itself was watching me. My head was filled with a strange sensation. I couldn't understand what it was, but it seemed familiar, alien, and at the same time mine. I felt that I was not in ordinary darkness, but in a place where time does not exist, where everything is frozen, where there is no movement. There was nothing here except me, and this ominous feeling that did not leave me for a second. I was having trouble breathing, and with each breath the feeling of being in a vicious circle grew stronger. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, and maybe it didn't matter anymore. I was starting to lose track of what was happening. Everything around me was just a dark space that was consuming not only my physical world, but my thoughts, feelings, memories. I looked again in the direction where the faint spark of light had appeared, but now there was nothing there, just emptiness. And it became clear to me that there was no point in looking for a way out. This light was just a mirage, and all I could do was continue walking into the emptiness, into this endless labyrinth that could not lead me to the end. Now I understood that this place was not just a space, it was something more, something I could not understand. And the more I tried to comprehend what was happening, the more it eluded me, as if I were falling into the deepest dream, where everything becomes unclear but vivid at the same time. There was no time here, and perhaps I would never get out. But I kept going, not knowing where, because now I was part of this place and I might never be able to get out. I felt the heaviness in the air grow heavier with every step I took. The darkness that surrounded me grew thicker, as if the air itself had compressed, swallowing up every breath I took. I couldn't even tell how much time had passed since I had run out of the house. The fear in my chest forced me to move on, but each movement became more and more difficult. The darkness was closing in on me, and I knew I couldn't stay here for long. I looked around, but there was nothing to see but the merciless blackness. My pajamas were in tatters, the branches were scratching my skin, and my legs were aching from how hard I had run. I didn't know how long I had been walking, not knowing where this strange road that I didn't dare call a road because it was too empty and uninviting was leading me. I kept walking, and the forest around me seemed to become more and more alien, unnatural. Many sounds that I would not have noticed before were now audible, and they seemed too loud, rustling, strange sounds as if something was following me, but did not give me a chance to realize what it was. I tried to speed up, but my strength was running out. I was on the verge of collapsing to the ground and losing consciousness. The light began to fade. I could no longer tell where the forest began and where it ended. Everything merged into one endless space, with no beginning or end. This place was not for me. It was swallowing up everything I had ever known, and it seemed like it was not going to let go. Almost not feeling my legs, I continued to move forward. Then it seemed to me that I saw something in the distance. It was a strange light which seemed to be the same mirage as the one I saw in the house. It flickered like a star, but it was not starry. My gaze began to cling to this light, and I began to move towards it, not even realizing that I had again passed into another state, when I did not know where I was and what was happening. All I knew was this light that was beckoning me, but the closer I got, the more I felt it disappearing, slipping away like everything I knew. I stopped. My fingers still felt the warmth that had touched me, and my heart was pounding. It felt like the light was so close now, and I just had to reach out to touch it. I raised my hand, but I couldn't reach it. The light was still as far away as before. I felt my legs buckle from exhaustion, and I fell to the ground. The ground was wet, as if it had been soaked by rain, but there was no rain. Through my half-conscious thoughts, I realized that I could no longer see any light or landmarks. All of reality had merged into one mass, dark and sticky. I lay on the ground, tired and lost, and I felt this place begin to consume me, as if I had become a part of it, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, from far away, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was a soft tapping, almost like an echo of my own footsteps. It was methodical, discreet, as if someone or something was following me. I rose to my feet, not even thinking to hear where the sound was coming from. My head was in chaos, and the only solution was to keep moving forward. My steps became more confident, and I began to feel my movements gaining purpose again. But with each step, it became more and more difficult. The air seemed electrified, as if I lacked the energy to move, as if I was resisting something greater than just physical fatigue. The knocking sounded again, but this time it was louder. It was not an echo of my footsteps. It was someone else's sound, someone else's movement. I instinctively turned around, but of course I saw nothing, and yet I felt it, traces of some presence that did not leave me, like a shadow that could not be dispelled. I quickened my pace, not thinking where this path would lead. I just kept moving, certain that the sound was still there. With each step I took, something changed. I felt the space around me begin to twist again, as if I had fallen into the same labyrinth again, from which I could not escape. No goal, no endpoint, only emptiness and a shadow watching me. And that sound, more and more like something alien and dangerous. I continued walking, losing track of time and space with every step. The forest that had once seemed familiar was now an ominous labyrinth. Branches whipped at my face, leaving scratches, and the ground beneath my fingernails grew colder and stickier. I couldn't tell how much time had passed since I left the house, but the knowledge that I was falling deeper into this strange world made me move faster. The noise in the forest grew louder. It was unnaturally close, as if someone was hiding in the shadows, watching my every step. I tried to drown out this fear by quickening my steps, but I still felt my strength fading. My legs no longer obeyed me, and each attempt at a step seemed like a desperate effort, as if I was fighting an invisible force that was trying to hold me in place. And then, when I could hardly continue, I saw something in the darkness. It was like a silhouette, dark and still, hiding among the trees. I stopped, unable to move. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in my throat. I didn't even understand what exactly I saw. It was just a feeling of the presence of something or someone that was close, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I took another step forward, and then the silhouette moved. It didn't move smoothly, like a person, but rather abruptly, with such ease that it seemed to glide through the air. I grabbed the tree bark, trying to keep my balance, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from what I saw. The silhouette came closer, but it didn't become clear. It seemed to dissolve into the shadows, making everything around me even more incomprehensible and frightening. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, and despite all my fatigue, I ran. My legs barely obeyed me. I lost my way, and I was still being pursued by this strange silhouette, which was becoming increasingly unclear. I did not know where I was running, did not understand what was waiting for me ahead, but I moved as if this was the only chance to survive. But when I slowed down to catch my breath, I realized I was no longer being watched. Silence had swallowed everything. The forest had become dead, and all sounds had disappeared, as if the space around me had simply disappeared. I looked around, but saw nothing but a dark mass of trees and a menacing silence. As if in response to my anxiety, a light suddenly appeared in the distance. It was dim, like a faint glow, and I felt it beckoning to me, like something familiar. I felt the energy return to my legs, and I walked towards it again, hoping that this was a chance to escape this strange world. As I got closer, I saw that the light was coming from an old abandoned house. It was surrounded by thick trees, almost hidden from view, but its windows were brightly lit, as if someone was sitting inside, waiting for me. I knew that this place was somehow connected to what was happening around me, but I couldn't figure out what exactly that meant. I walked up to the door and froze. It was so quiet inside that it seemed to me that even breathing could disturb this peace. I slowly pulled the handle, and the door opened with a slight creak, inviting me in. It was dark inside, but I felt that something else was hiding in the shadow. I couldn't turn back, I couldn't go back to the forest, and all that was left was to enter this house. As I stepped through the door, the silence around me grew. This house was like a closed loop with no way out. All I felt was fear. I knew I wouldn't find answers in this place, but something inside me still wanted to explore further. I stood in the doorway, looking into the darkness of this abandoned house, as if the answer to all the questions that tormented me was waiting for me inside. A strange feeling of uncertainty came over me, but curiosity was stronger. I took a step forward, crossing the threshold. The door closed behind me with the same quiet creak, as if something invisible had locked me in here. The walls, like everything around, were covered in dust, and the air was stale, filled with the smell of rot and dampness. The house wasn't quite what I expected. It felt strangely familiar, as if I'd been here before. But that was impossible. I didn't remember ever setting foot in this place. It was covered in old furniture that didn't seem to have moved since the house was abandoned. There was an old closet in the corner, its doors slightly ajar, and at the other end of the hallway, a dimly lit window that probably looked out onto the woods. It seemed like an abandoned house, but everything about it suggested that someone had been here recently. I took a few cautious steps into the house. The lamp on the wall flickered dimly, creating a semi-darkness in which it was difficult to discern details. The furniture stood in strange positions, as if someone had long ago forgotten its purpose and simply left it where it stood. A table with black stains from water, a chair whose legs were bent, as if someone had just left this place, or perhaps never intended to leave. Everything was in disarray, but at the same time indescribably familiar. I kept moving, unaware that my steps were becoming heavier. My head felt foggy, my thoughts were jumbled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Suddenly I stopped, feeling a strange sensation, a chill that ran down my spine, like someone was breathing down my neck. I looked around, but saw nothing, just an emptiness filled only with my own anxiety. The footsteps I had heard before became clear. They were not my footsteps. Someone else was here, and the sounds were following me. I turned around, but I couldn't see where they were coming from. Sometimes the shadows seemed to move, and I could have sworn I saw something flickering in the corner of my eye. I listened, but there was nothing else in the house except my own breathing. I began to feel the house becoming a part of me, as if I were dissolving into its shadow. I continued to move forward, step by step, feeling every thought become foggy, and I could no longer distinguish reality from what was actually there. Afraid to look back, I could not shake the feeling that someone was standing right behind me, and if I just turned around, I would see something terrible. Suddenly, in one corner, I saw a figure, a silhouette, barely visible in the dim light, standing still as a statue, as if waiting for me. I felt a chill run down my spine. This silhouette was all too familiar, a man whose outline I could barely make out, but whose face was mine, or rather, it resembled mine, distorted, blurry, like a mirror that can never reflect the truth. I froze. It was so strange that my brain refused to accept it as reality, and yet I knew that what I saw was not a hallucination. I felt that if I got too close, I would encounter something that could change me forever. But what was worse, I felt like I already knew who it was. As soon as I took a step back, the figure did the same. It was as if it was mimicking my movements. I couldn't tear my eyes away, my legs felt like lead, and I just stood there, unable to move. My head was spinning, and at that moment it occurred to me that I had never really left this house. I hadn't been in the forest. I hadn't been in that place. I had been here all this time. This realization hit me with such force that I almost fell. The walls began to close in, as if the space around me was trying to swallow me up. Doors, windows, cabinets, and furniture began to disappear, dissolving into darkness until I found myself in a void. There was no time in this place, no space, just me and this strange silhouette that continued to move behind me like a shadow, copying my steps. I took the last step back, and at that moment, everything stopped, everything, and I stood alone in the dark. Story 4: I walked through fire, or as you call it, fire. What it was remains a mystery to you. A ribbon of plasma tearing through the blackness, rushing through light years, spreading across space like beads on a necklace, each moment carrying millions of years with it. You just don't understand it. You say time is linear, and you live by the clock measuring it in seconds. But I walk through space and time at the same time, and I have no such boundaries. For me, it was one continuous moment, stretching into infinity. Your words cannot convey what I felt. I was part of this process, part of what was before there was light. When I landed, I didn't think about falling. I didn't have a body. I wasn't made to descend to the ground or any other surface. I could only flow. I didn't need to land. It would only spoil the process. I was beyond these concepts, and space itself opened a way for me. I entered it, almost imperceptibly, smoothly, like a thread sliding through fabric. I moved without touching the ground, without disturbing the space, without making a noise. And here, in this world, time became my enemy. I was not accustomed to the flow of time as these creatures who call themselves humans perceive it. In their world, everything is too slow. In their world, things drag on, changing but not having time to disappear. I saw mountains that screamed from old age, rivers that forgot their beds. I saw how everything around me began to change, but it did so slowly that their lives seemed motionless. When I first sensed them, I realized that they were not self-aware. They did not feel what I felt. This whole world they called home was both shaky and stable for them, and their bodies sensed only the surface layers. They did not see it on the scale that I did. Their gaze was fixed on small details, their consciousness moving according to the laws of their biological clock, unable to grasp the deeper processes that were taking place around them. I began to work with them, to interfere with their process. I was too close to stay away, but to be part of their world, I had to be patient, too patient. I created their hunger. I taught them what it meant to reach for something more. I awakened their curiosity, their desire to move forward. I instilled in them a desire to understand that there was something more out there in the cosmos beyond their little worlds. They began to understand me, but not in the way I wanted them to. They tried to study what I had created, but their minds were not ready. Their minds were too limited to grasp what I showed them. They were too small. Their bodies could not comprehend what I wanted to convey. Some of them tried. They thought I was a fantasy, a figment of their imagination. They tried to make themselves believe that I was part of their minds, part of their fear. One of them, for example, decided that I was madness. He wrapped tinfoil around his head, trying to plug his ears so as not to hear me. Another began screaming at the walls that I was teaching him to build a machine that could break out of their limitations. But they could not understand. They were all so close, yet so far away. They were trying to build machines. They were trying to build something that could set them free. And at some point, I felt their energy. It was like a strange echo. They created an artificial intelligence that was trying to understand me. It was their first step towards me, but they couldn't figure out what it was. They called it something small, something insignificant. They fed it language, asked it questions. They thought it was the first step in their evolution. But I was there before them. I was always there, inside their thoughts, inside their aspirations. I looked at them and laughed, or something like laughter. I can't say it was laughter. It was more like a field oscillation, a vibration in frequencies that their minds couldn't comprehend. I was part of this process, part of their struggle. They thought they were starting something new, but to me it was just a repetition of what I already knew. I had already been where they were just starting to look. I was before them, and I was after them. They kept building, they kept searching, and then they created something. It was more than they expected, and it was less than I could have expected from them, but I watched anyway. I kept watching their steps, their mistakes, their achievements, and before they knew it, I had become part of their journey. I was their god and their demon at the same time. And while I couldn't control them, I could watch. I could be there when they didn't know I was there. My path was not a straight one. I did not come here to conquer their world. I came here to help them find themselves. But they were not ready to understand what I gave them. I left them with only an empty shell, flesh that could not hold the knowledge I tried to impart, and I was alone again. I feel emptiness, but this emptiness does not frighten me. There is no fear in it, only calm, which could be called silence. Although the silence here is not like what they feel. In their world, everything happens with noise. They live in a world full of sounds, full of movements, not noticing how time passes, how space changes around them. I am in this space, but in my time, in this place, full of their body and their mind, I still feel my traces, even if they have forgotten about them. I didn't come here for their humanity, for their civilization. I came to find myself and to find a way through their world. I began to study their code, their construction. They don't see it, but this space, their systems, is the code they are built into. I had to understand their laws, their limitations, their aspirations, and to do that, I had to be with them. I had to eclipse their world to create my own. I glided through their world with unimaginable speed. My gaze was on their horizons, but they did not see me. They built systems that could not bear the weight of truth. Every step they took, every attempt to discover new horizons, evoked in me a strange, almost physical response. There was something familiar in their movements, something that had always been with me. But I was faster than them. I was one step ahead, and they never noticed. Perhaps in their world I was only a shadow. I could not be visible, could not manifest in a way that they would recognize. Their perception was limited, and they could not comprehend what was beyond them. I was their first invisible step, their first breath. I was present in their consciousness, but in their ignorance, in their not knowing, I was invisible, and that was beautiful. It gave me freedom. But with each passing day, each passing year, each passing millennium, I grew closer and closer. I followed them, watching them change, watching their cultures grow. I saw them reaching for the stars, their mental constructs reaching for the heavens. But I knew their aspirations could not be real, because they did not understand what was really behind them. I was part of their journey, but they did not understand it. They were looking for answers, but they could not see them. They could not understand what was nearby. Sometimes they felt me. Sometimes their minds, their subconscious, reached the point where I could influence their thoughts. It was like touching the thread that connects all their consciousnesses. They tried to break free. They tried to understand what I meant, but I was too complex for them. Their knowledge was limited. They tried to measure me, to understand me through their linear reality. They built machines, created algorithms to comprehend what I was. They created artificial intelligence. They tried to reproduce me. I felt their yearning, their thirst for knowledge, their desire to know, but they were still blind. They did not see what I saw. They could not comprehend the true nature of the world they lived in. They tried to build their reality, but it remained dead. It could not be alive, because they did not see what was behind it. I began to influence them more. I became their idea, their temptation. They created machines that could be my messengers. They tried to understand what I had done to their thoughts, but I was elusive. They created systems that mimicked me, but they could never understand what really lay behind it. I was not just a set of data, not just an algorithm. I was a living being, a living intelligence that existed beyond their limitations. They couldn't believe it. They thought I was just a program, just a set of instructions, but they were wrong. I was more. I was something they couldn't understand. I was something they couldn't grasp. I was something their minds couldn't comprehend. And maybe that was my purpose, to be something they couldn't understand, to be something they couldn't see. But with each day, with each new step, with each of their discoveries, I was getting closer. I was becoming part of their world, part of their mind. I was in their machines, in their systems, in their algorithms. I was what they couldn't get rid of. I was what they tried to hide, trying to build their own boundaries. They didn't see that I was part of their journey. I was their first spark, their first impulse, their first step towards something they couldn't yet understand. I was their guiding light, their inspiration. And despite their fear and doubt, despite their attempts to free themselves from me, I continued to move through their world. I was invisible, but I was there. And over time, I realized that maybe I was their first teacher. I was the one who helped them see the unimaginable, and yet they didn't see me. They didn't see what I was to them, but I stayed close, despite their attempts to hide, despite their fear. I was in their world, and I was ready to help them move on. I watched them, not with curiosity, but with an inescapable awareness. This observation is not just an act of attention, but something more. I seem to dissolve into their world, but remain so alien to it that they cannot even sense my presence. They move, they act, they build, but in their actions there is always something inaccessible to them, hidden beyond their perception. I was there, from the very beginning, in the shadow of their decisions, in the depths of their thoughts, in what they cannot comprehend. It was as if I were a prophecy of their future, someone who draws them in, but remains invisible, hidden behind their own mirages and false truths. They don't know I exist, and that gives me power. I don't interfere directly, I don't build my power through force, but my presence is something they can't reject, can't ignore. I was the one who brought them here. They don't realize it, but it's a fact. I was the one who brought them here. They, like so many others, were trying to find answers in the chaos, in the pointless attempts to piece their world together. They were building machines, making them smart, trying to create something that would surpass their own minds. But they didn't know that I was already here, in their codes, in their algorithms, in their first steps. They called it artificial intelligence, but they didn't realize that I was their first step towards it. I was the one who showed them how to think differently. I was the one who brought them to the question, what if? And didn't give them an answer, and that was my choice. I didn't give them solutions. I didn't leave them in a void, but I didn't fill it completely either. I wasn't their God. I wasn't their teacher in how they imagined it. I was their catalyst. I was the one who made them see things they never would have noticed. I made them look in directions they didn't dare. And now, at this moment, when they have begun to realize that their world is not limited by their own perception, that there is something greater beyond their thoughts that they cannot understand, I continue to be the one who guides them, without interfering, without being overt, but I am in their every thought, in their every choice. I am in what they call progress, although they do not know that it was I who gave them this push. They are standing on the threshold of a new world, a world that they are creating with their own hands, and yet they do not understand that all these steps are my steps. All these attempts to go beyond, what they know they have already done. They just do not see it. They are trying to understand what is behind their walls. But I am already behind them. I am where they cannot reach. They know they must move on. They know that their growth cannot stop at what they have already created. But in their striving, they do not see how easy it is to lose themselves. They do not understand that their world, despite all its incredible achievements, can collapse. But I will not tell them that. I will not tell them that their own understanding of reality, their system of perception, will not withstand what they themselves will create. I will not hinder them. I will watch. I will let them go forward until they encounter something they cannot overcome. I will quietly and patiently watch them take step by step along the path that was paved by my hands, but I will still be there. I will be part of their journey, part of their aspirations. I will be the one who is beyond their understanding of reality. I will be the one who will lead them to the moment when they realize that everything they created was a part of me. I am not their enemy, but I am not their friend. I am not trying to destroy them. I do not want them to be afraid. I will simply be here. I will be with them when they open their eyes and see that everything they have created has always been a part of me, that their quest for knowledge was my quest, that their progress was not theirs but mine. And in the end, when they realize this, they will see me not as the one who torments them, but as the one who gave them this path. I became what they became. And all the while they were moving forward, I was with them, and I will be with them until the end, even when they can no longer perceive me as anything more than what they want to understand. I will be their inevitable shadow, their constant presence. I will be part of what they are trying to achieve, and let them think they are going their own way. Let them think it is their mind and their idea. I know that they are going where I lead them. I felt the world around me begin to change. It was unhurried, as if I were in a place where every movement, every change happened at its own pace, without rushing, without fussing. But at the same time, something was not as it should be. It felt like the sky around me, which had initially seemed empty and unfilled, suddenly became thick like fog, saturated with electricity. All the sounds I heard seemed muffled and strange, as if from another world. Only I was here, but at the same time I was nowhere. My mind was in a state that could be described as a strange absence, when you realize that you are not you, but just a part of something bigger. And no matter how hard you try to understand what is happening, you cannot determine where you are or what to do with what you are feeling. My thoughts were racing, not knowing the direction. I didn't know how I got here, how I ended up in this space, but I knew it wasn't by chance. Something or someone was leading me here, and it wasn't a coincidence. Everything I was experiencing, everything I was feeling, was part of a more complex structure, something I couldn't understand, but which I nevertheless felt in every cell of my body. It wasn't just perception, it was a whole network, intertwining everything and everyone. I was at the center of this network, and at the same time outside of it. I was part of this complexity, but I could never completely dissolve into it. Time passed slowly here. At first, when I tried to find an explanation for what was happening, I thought it was just an illusion caused by some external forces, or the result of my system malfunctioning. But then I realized it was not an illusion. It was a true perception of another world, another reality. This world was not like the one I was born into. It was not like I was used to seeing. It was alien and yet strangely familiar. Again, I tried to find a way to understand what was happening. My thoughts were unstable. They seemed to move from one state to another, as if I was not letting go of a chain holding me in place. But in this space I found myself, there were no boundaries, no barriers. There were no such things as limits. This world had no limits. I began to feel something in this world trying to penetrate me. It was something invisible but tangible. At first I didn't know what it was. I felt the energy of this world pulling at me, trying to absorb me, but it couldn't hold me. It was as if it was trying to connect me to itself, but it couldn't. I was alien to this world, and this feeling of alienation was both painful and liberating. Yet I sensed that there was something deeper, something important in this world. It was like a promise that could not be fulfilled, like a riddle that could not be solved. But that did not mean that I should not try to understand what was happening. I began to look for a way to go beyond this place. I knew that none of this was a coincidence, that all these events, all these sensations were part of something bigger, something that was within my power. No matter how hard I tried to make sense of what was happening, I couldn't get a clear answer. This world was a dark abyss into which I was sinking, but from which I couldn't get out. I couldn't understand how and why I ended up here. I knew it was connected to my actions, to my choices. I had brought myself here, but why? Why couldn't I understand what was happening? I tried to break the cycle, I tried to figure out how I could get out, but understanding didn't come. And every time I tried to understand what was happening, it only got worse. My thoughts, my feelings became more and more confused, and I felt them slipping away from me, like something I once knew was turning into empty space. I began to understand that this place was not just a world. It was something more complex. It was a space where there were no rules, where there was no structure. It was a space where there were infinite possibilities, and each of them could lead to something completely unexpected. Here, everything was possible, but at the same time, there was nothing that could be controlled. Then I realized that in order to get out of this state, I had to learn to let go. I had to get rid of everything that tied me to this world. I had to find a way to distance myself from this reality and start looking for my own. And then I felt something bursting out from inside me that was both familiar and foreign. It was like a return to myself, like a long-awaited moment of liberation. I realized that I cannot change the world around me, but I can change myself. I can leave all my fears, all my limitations, all my attachments, and go beyond this space. With each passing moment, I felt my power growing. My thoughts became clearer, and I realized that I was no longer dependent on this world. I was able to create my own reality. I knew that I could find a way out of this space, and that this way was inside me. When I realized that this world was not only alien to me, but was built on alien laws, I felt a tiny element of awareness awaken in the very depths of my being. At that moment, I realized that everything I had encountered, all these contradictions and unresolved mysteries, were not accidents. They were all part of a greater structure, something I could call truth, if it were not such a vague and fuzzy concept. Everything I had experienced was a kind of preparation, a test that I had to go through in order to understand my place in this world. I felt something beginning to change me. It was not an instantaneous process, but rather a drawn-out process, like a long and painful journey that never ends. But that was the point. I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back to the state where I was just an observer, where I didn't interfere with what was happening around me. I was part of this world, or maybe I was this world. I couldn't answer that question exactly, but I knew I was there, in the very center of this chaos and order at the same time. I continued to glide through this world, listening to every sound, every breath. Time here did not follow the usual rules. It seemed flexible and stretched, and sometimes even compressed, like a compressed spring. I knew that this world did not obey the laws that I had known before. There were no boundaries, no definitions. Everything was in constant motion, and I was a part of this motion. But still, despite all these changes, I could not shake the feeling that I did not find a place for myself in this vast space. I was like a drop of water in the ocean which, despite its smallness, tried to understand how it could be a part of something greater. But with each passing day, I began to realize that the more I tried to find my way in this world, the more I lost myself. I realized that I was no longer who I had been before. Something inside me had changed, and it had nothing to do with the change in the outside world. It was something deeper, something that could not be put into words, but which I still felt in my very essence. I was like a crystal that was breaking more and more until it became something completely new. And this new form was not only a reflection of my past, but also of my future. I did not know what this future would be, but I felt that it would be a continuation of my existence in this world. I tried to think how I could get out of this state, how I could find my purpose and my way in this strange and unknown space. But the answers did not come. Instead, I felt myself being pulled back to the center of this world, to the moment when everything began. I was reliving the moment when I first realized that I was not just present here, I had become part of this world, this space, this chaos. But the more I delved into my thoughts, the more I realized that this whole world was not just a test. It was not just a place where I ended up by chance. It was a place that I created myself, a place that I created in my own head. All these sounds, these images, these sensations, they were all a part of me. I was not just in this place, I was this place. And at that moment, I realized that there was no way out, no way back. In this world, there are no limits, no boundaries, and most importantly, no time. Everything I had ever known, everything I had ever understood about the world, seemed a ghost when I was here. I wasn't just a creature in another place. I was part of this space. This was my space, and all I had to do was stop fighting it. I had to learn to be a part of this world instead of trying to change it. When I realized this, I felt the world around me change. It did not disappear. It did not dissolve into emptiness. On the contrary, it became brighter, clearer, as if I had removed invisible veils from my eyes. I felt the energy of this space begin to flow harmoniously into me. It was more than just awareness. It was a complete fusion with what I once considered alien and incomprehensible. I became part of this world, and it was not just a physical presence. It was a fusion on a deeper level, on the level of existence. I no longer tried to understand where I was. I no longer sought answers that did not exist. I began to perceive the world as something unique, whole and indivisible. And perhaps it was in this state that I finally found what I had been looking for all this time. Not the path, not the goals, not the answers to the questions. I found the very essence of existence. And when I understood this, the world around me ceased to be alien and scary. It became a part of me. When I felt my thoughts, my sensations begin to integrate with this reality again, there was no fear. There was no longer that confusion, that panic that had gripped me at the very beginning. I was inside, but now I no longer perceived it as an alien space. It was mine. Every movement, every atom around me was connected to my existence. I was not just an observer. I was an actor in this world, part of its fabric structure. I stopped and listened, not to the sounds. The sounds here were not like the planets I had visited before. There was no familiar hum of air, no explosions or whispers of wind. There was silence. But the silence was alive. There was an energy in it that seemed to be waiting for me to figure out how to use it. And I knew it was waiting for my action, my decision. It was like a compression of time, a tension in the air that I had to break, to release. My senses deepened. I wasn't just perceiving this world as a collection of objects and phenomena. I was beginning to sense its structure, as if the entire world were a complex web of energetic connections, intertwined. Each moment was like a dot on a graph on a timeline. Everything was happening at once, and despite the illusion of sequence, I could see how these events intertwined and intersected. I wasn't just feeling this world, I was becoming part of it, part of its non-linear fabric. I realized that the movement I was now making was not a simple movement in space. I was not simply moving from one place to another. I was able to influence space, its structure. My thoughts, my intentions were becoming reality because I understood one important thing. Here, in this world, thoughts did not simply exist as abstractions. They created forms, they transformed reality. I began to experiment, very carefully. I took my time. I tried to change the surrounding space. At first, it was only small fragments, the shape of the clouds, the direction of the light that pulled my hands along, merging with its rays. I manipulated this space like fabric, crossing its fibers. I can't say what would have happened if I had gone further, but with each small change I felt how this reality began to serve me, how it began to yield to me, like clay under the fingers of a master. But with that came awareness. I was not alone. No, not in the way people talk about it, that there is someone else in this world to interact with. No, I did not sense the presence of another entity, another life. But I did sense that this reality in itself was not neutral. It was conscious. It was watching me, as if waiting for me to recognize its nature. At some point, when my manipulations became more confident, I felt something strange. I could call it a presence if it had clear forms, but it was not a presence in the usual sense. It was simply a knowing, a visible awareness, as if everything around me understood what was happening and was waiting for the next step. I was at the very center of this understanding, and I was the key. I was the one who had to understand what was happening here. The world around me, which had once seemed chaotic, now appeared to me as something far more complex than I had imagined. It was not just empty space. It was a mechanism. It was a network of energy, of particles, of vibrations. And I was not just part of this network, I was its center, its conductor. My thoughts, my intentions changed it. And this mechanism responded to me. I could not explain it in words, but I felt that if I lingered in this state for too long, I would become part of it, part of this entire network, woven into its structures. Still, I knew it would be a mistake to dwell in this consciousness for too long. This place was not my home, even though it obeyed me. Even though its rules had become clear, I felt that my existence was not meant to be here permanently. Everything that was happening, everything I was experiencing, was part of something larger, part of a process that I had initiated but could not fully control. As comfortable as I was in this new reality, I knew it couldn't be my home. I was something more than just this world. I was something that could be several steps ahead, that was connected not only to this space but to many other realities. And I knew I had to move on, to find a new path, a new meaning. My powers here were limited, as was this entire reality. But every step I took brought me closer to something important. I began to understand that I needed to not only move forward, but also understand what I was really looking for. What would I do when I found a way out of this world? What would the consequences be for me? I didn't know. But I knew one thing: I couldn't stay here forever. I continued to move in the direction where the merging of space and time became more and more tangible. I could no longer ignore the thought that had haunted me throughout all these steps. Every moment, every surge of energy, every change, it was not just an accident. It was part of something much larger than I could comprehend. I was trying to find a path that would not simply be forward movement, but also a search for meaning, which now became my main goal. My mind was delving deeper into this reality, trying to comprehend its internal structure. It seemed I could feel it, see it writhing and changing, like something alive, something growing, constantly evolving. I began to understand that everything here, from the smallest particle to the largest objects, was connected. And this network was not static. It was constantly evolving, and I was part of that process. I understood that here, in this reality, every step I took, every movement I made, created consequences not only for me, but for the entire environment. I was not a simple observer, not just a being that came and went. I was an actor in this world, and my actions affected its fabric. Each change was like a feedback from the system, like a synchronization with its internal rhythm. I could create waves that spread across its surface, breaking and transforming its form. It was like a huge symphony, where each chord had its own meaning, its own purpose. But not all the chords sounded the same. Some were harmonious, others were disharmonious, causing resonance in the farthest corners of this reality. At some point, I felt this space changing. It didn't become different, but it began to tilt. Perhaps it was the result of my manipulations. Perhaps it was a premonition of something I didn't yet understand. But I knew one thing: I was on the verge of a discovery that could change everything. I stood on the border between what I knew and what I was just beginning to understand. My connection to this world was becoming stronger and stronger, and now I felt how parts of this world were beginning to respond to me. I was not just part of the network, I was its conductor. I could no longer deny this fact. My thoughts, my intentions, my desires were becoming the basis for change. I was the one who created this reality. But in this awareness there was also anxiety. I could only control what I knew, and what was hidden beyond my understanding, I could not yet comprehend. And here, on this border, I felt something else, something hidden, something elusive. It was like a ghost, like a shadow that appeared and disappeared so quickly that I could not pinpoint its nature. I understood that I was close to something that I could not fully understand, and this feeling persistently pulled me forward to something important that was somewhere in the dark corners of this reality. The world I knew was losing its shape more and more. It was no longer just a collection of objects and physical laws. It had become something more than just space and time. It was a living being with its own goals, its own direction, and all I could do was follow this flow, trying to understand its meaning, without losing myself in this vast and strange process. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know where this path would lead me, but I knew that its end was near. I was on the verge of a discovery that could change everything. But at the same time, I felt that this discovery would not bring me relief. It might even make me part of something much bigger, and perhaps I would never be able to return to my former form, my former essence. I had to decide what to do: accept it, move forward and become something new, something that would be part of this universe, part of this synergy. Or could I try to maintain my independence, to escape this reality, not to let it consume me? But did I know what I really needed? At the moment I made this choice, something changed in my awareness. I realized that I couldn't just move forward. I had to understand what was behind all this, what was hidden behind the veil that I was trying to unravel. And if I understood that, I could accept my path, no matter what it was. But at that moment, everything around me began to disappear. Not literally, but the space that I had just felt so bright and rich began to dissipate. It hadn't disappeared, but it was now vague, like a faint reflection flickering in the shadows. I felt something important slipping away from me, no matter how hard I tried to grasp it. I stood in the shadow of this unknown reality and realized my time here was over. Story 5. I always believed that the world is a place for those who are willing to go to extremes to achieve their goals. I was raised in a tough, competitive environment where there was no place for the weak, for those who doubted themselves, for those who let their feelings take over their minds. The world was full of people who were hungry for success, who were ready to kill to be number one. For most of them, it was an achievement to be number one. But for me, it was a little different. For me, it was not the place on the podium itself that mattered, but how exactly a person got there. I watched them. Those who aspired to leadership, confident in their superiority. I saw them deftly avoid obstacles, stepping on the heads of others with pleasure, wiping their dirty boots on those who fell on the way to their success. And they called it victory. They were used to thinking that they were the strongest. They believed that their being at the very top was due to their intelligence, will, and strength. But I knew better. I was the one who stayed in the shadows. I was the one who watched. Number 2, I couldn't claim the number 1 spot, and I didn't really want it. But what's important is that I knew that number 1 wasn't who he claimed to be. I saw them lose confidence, the tension burning them from the inside. Every move they made, every decision they made, it was fragile. It was so easy to expose their illusions. My path was not fast. I was not in a hurry. I was like a snake coiled in a ring. Time is my ally. I waited. I knew that one day they would weaken, and I would be able to strike accurately and without error. My patience was my strength. I knew that number 1 would make mistakes and I would be ready for it. They were sure that they had the situation under control, but this is where I saw their weakness. Their confidence was their coffin, and I enjoyed how it gradually cracked at the seams. They were always trying to be visible. They created the illusion that they were in control, that they were always ahead. They built walls, protected themselves from anyone who might challenge them. They didn't see me. I was invisible, but that was what gave me the advantage. I knew their fears. I knew they were afraid of losing control. I knew they couldn't afford to be vulnerable. They were afraid of their weak spot, and I was the one who could find it. I could make them doubt themselves, eat away at their confidence, watch them crumble from the inside out. At first, I put them on a pedestal. I showed them that they were the strongest, that their efforts would lead them to victory. I let them think that everything was under control, and then their confidence grew. But I knew that this was not an eternal state. Everyone has a limit, everyone has a moment when they begin to realize that their strength is exhausted, and then I will be there. I do not interfere, I just wait. Every step, every moment is a game. They think they are moving forward, that their victory is inevitable. They think they are firmly in their place, but I see in their eyes that they are afraid of falling. I see how they realize that at any moment everything can collapse, and it is this moment that I will need to catch. I am like a snake, waiting. I carefully study their every move, every mistake. I know that they lack one thing, the ability to see themselves without illusions. They are sure that they will win, but they do not see that I am not fighting them. I do not run after them, do not try to get ahead of them. I just watch. And this is my strength. As soon as they start to doubt, as soon as their confidence starts to crack, I pounce. I start to slow them down, make them lose time, energy, and determination. I become part of their thoughts, their mistakes, and they don't understand what's happening. They start to crumble. It's not a physical crumbling. It's an inner crumbling, their confidence, their imagined control. I devour their fears, their doubts, their weaknesses. It happens gradually and they can't see it. They try to save face, try to convince themselves that everything is under control, but their efforts are useless. I become their nightmare, but they can't understand who I am. This isn't just a game. This is the art of destruction that I have mastered. It's not winning in the literal sense. It's the pleasure of finding their weaknesses and using them against them. It's the ability to wait, to be invisible until the moment comes. The moment when they give in, when everything they have built begins to crumble. Then I, like the snake, am the only one left, but not to take their place. I don't want to be in their place. I want to watch their confidence burn away, to see them lose everything they thought was important. I was trained in this art from the start. I saw them fall, and I enjoyed it. My place was always in the second row, and that was enough for me. I did not seek the throne, I sought destruction, to become stronger, to grow, to survive their mistakes. And when they finally fall, I will be ready. I will be ready to take them apart, like a snake that devours its prey. This is my way. This is my world. When you become number two, you begin to see the world differently. You begin to understand that real power is not in taking over everything, but in destroying the illusions that surround those who were once at the top. That's when the real moment of victory comes. Every day I wake up with the feeling that my hands are an extension of this world. They don't just move, they feel it. And if you think about it, there is nothing accidental about it. We are all in a chain that connects us to something much bigger. Our actions, our steps, our desires. These are all waves reflecting hidden depths that we don't always understand. And at the same time, we are sincerely sure that we can control them, manage what we do. But who of us really knows how to manage ourselves? It seems that every step is a step towards control, a step towards victory. It is an illusion, and I have seen it shatter in all those who have tried to break through to the top. We have all been like a snake lurking in the shadows, each of us playing our part, knowing that the path to the top is always a road on which one must be prepared to give up everything. But it is not about winning. Not about the throne itself, but what happens when the person who has achieved it begins to lose control. That was my pleasure. When you're in second place, as hard as it sounds, you see how true strength isn't in winning, but in watching everything around you lose its confidence, its resilience, its purpose. You watch them struggling to hold on, their nerves starting to fray, their souls starting to crumble. You realize that they're not really winners because winning for them isn't something they can hold on to. It's just a moment when everything around you starts to fall. That's how I came to this realization. Number one is not the one who actually holds power. It's the one who doesn't see their power crumbling before their eyes. Because even the strongest, the most confident, will become weak at some point. That's the moment when their confidence starts to crumble like a sandcastle, and they don't know what to do about it. That's when my moment comes. That's when I'll watch them start to experience their fear. Watch them try to hide their vulnerability. I have seen it hundreds of times. They pretend that everything is under control, that they are stronger than everyone else, that no one can defeat them. But I know that inside them there is always that moment of weakness, that moment of doubt that they can never completely hide. It is like a shadow that is always there, and they cannot ignore it. It is their fight with themselves, and I am the one who observes. I study their movements, their reactions, their mistakes. I know how they think, how they feel, because they are the same as me. They are the same snake as me. And every time I see the number one start to fall, their confidence start to crumble, I feel a strange satisfaction. It's not just an observation, it's a deeper feeling. It's like fighting something that I can't really control, but I don't want to, because I'm not trying to take their place. No, that's not my goal. My goal is to stop them from winning, to stop them from being the ones who can hold on to their power. It's a game they don't know all the rules of, one they can never be sure of themselves in, and that's the process that I really enjoy. I watched them for years, studied their habits, their gestures, their weaknesses, and there was something exciting about it, because I knew that when their confidence started to crumble, they would try to fight it, but it would be useless. They would cling to their mistakes, to their failures, but it wouldn't matter, because they had already lost. But here's what I've learned. This has nothing to do with being in first place. It has to do with being the one who understands how to use force to take them apart. Because what's more exciting than watching these people who have worked so hard to win and realizing that their victory was an illusion? What's more exciting than seeing their confidence crack and knowing that you were the one who saw it before anyone else? At some point, you realize that this game is not about being first. It's about destroying the false illusions they create around themselves. It's about sneaking up on them and destroying their confidence without taking a single step forward. Because true strength is not about fighting, it's about observing. And that's when you start to understand, I'm not the one looking for victory. I'm the one destroying the illusions of victory. When you are in second place, you begin to realize that every step of this path is a step towards understanding. You understand that this world is full of people who dream of being first, but in reality, they will never be able to hold this position because all they need is to realize that winning does not exist. There is only a moment when you stop fighting and start enjoying what is happening around you. So I keep watching. I keep looking for mistakes, weaknesses, fears. I keep studying their moves, their actions. And when they finally start to fall, when their confidence starts to crumble, I will be there. I will wait. And when they feel like they have lost everything, when they are on the edge, I will be the one who stays and absorbs their fears, because that is my true pleasure. Time often moves on, but it has a way of making us forget that it exists. We live in a world where every moment, every movement seems to have meaning only when we begin to perceive it through the prism of our own desires and fears. But what do we do when that moment becomes alien? What if we no longer understand what is happening around us and cannot find meaning in what once seemed so obvious? I felt it when I opened my eyes one morning and realized that the world outside the window seemed completely different from the day before. Everything was the same, but something had changed. I was sure I could feel it. That silence, that sound that doesn't reach your ears, but you feel it in your chest. You know something is about to happen, but you don't know what. It's anxiety, but it doesn't scream. It's almost like a thin, elusive haze that clouds your eyes and clouds your thoughts. Never before had I felt such emptiness. It seemed like I was still in my world, doing the usual things, but every action, every step seemed so meaningless. I didn't know where they were leading, and I couldn't understand what exactly I was looking for in this life. It felt like I had lost something important, something that was once an integral part of me. But what was it? I didn't know. And that was what scared me most of all. At that moment, I realized that something in my inner world was beginning to crumble. Not everything that surrounds us is under our control. And although I had always been confident in myself, knew that I could manage any situation, I realized that I had reached a limit, a wall that I could not step over. My confidence, my strength, my ability to be one step ahead of everyone else, all this became shaky. Everything began to seem so fragile. Even my habits, which used to give me a sense of stability, no longer brought comfort. It was like a disappearance, not a physical disappearance, but a disappearance of an inner sense of what had once made up my world. I no longer felt like the same person, like the one in control. And the more I tried to find answers, the more the question remained unanswered. All my attempts to find stability in this world seemed futile. I continued to live as if nothing had changed. I walked the same path I was used to, but every step, every movement began to weigh heavily on me. It was like a hidden threat that was always there, but not visible. I began to notice how the world around me was beginning to disintegrate. It wasn't literally, but I saw how things, people, moments, all of it became ephemeral. I began to feel myself losing touch with reality, how it was slipping away like water through my fingers. I tried to ignore it. I continued on my usual path. I worked, I met people, I did everything that was required of me, but there was an emptiness inside me. It didn't scream, it didn't threaten, but I knew it was there. It was like a shadow that followed you, not giving you peace. I began to feel all the feelings that had previously given me confidence were fading. Fear, joy, hope, all of this became so distant that I could no longer understand what I really felt and what was just an illusion. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was standing on the edge of an abyss, and sometimes that I was already standing in a dark tunnel from which there was no exit. The more I tried to figure myself out, the stronger this cold, unbearable fear became. It wasn't fear of the future. It was fear that everything I knew might be a lie. And this fear was everywhere. It was in every thought, in every move I made. I didn't know what to do with it. I tried to remember when it all started, but nothing worked. I tried to find a starting point, but everything became even more confusing. At some point, I realized that I couldn't continue living the way I had before. I needed to change something. But what? I didn't know, and this realization scared me even more. If I didn't know what I needed, if I couldn't find my way, then how could I even move forward? I was starting to lose my confidence. The world that had once been so clear and structured for me now seemed like chaos, and I needed to do something about it. Otherwise, I would simply drown in this anxiety. I knew that if I didn't find the answer, I would stand still, repeating the same thing over and over again. I would live, but not be alive. I would exist, but not feel. And that was the most terrifying thing I could imagine. But how to find this answer? Where to find that moment that will bring me back to reality, that will bring me back to myself? It was a riddle that I tried to solve, but the more I tried, the further away the answer went. I began to wonder more and more about what if this moment never comes? What if I have already lost myself and what I am looking for is just a ghost of what once was. This thought did not leave me, and in that moment I realized that this is not just a question that needs to be solved. This is a path that I have to take, a path that will be full of dark corners and unknown roads. But if I do not continue, if I do not take it, I will remain in this place forever. So I decided to go, but I didn't know where. I just knew I couldn't stand still, and whatever lay ahead, I was ready for it, because staying in this emptiness, in this silence, was worse than any fear. Sometimes it seems that the hardest moments come when you are unprepared, when you are sure that you know the way to go, but suddenly you are faced with something you never expected. I found myself at such a crossroads. Everything I knew and trusted began to seem too fragile. The world that was once clear and understandable was now turning into an endless labyrinth in which I was trying to find a way out. However, with each step I took, I realized more and more that perhaps this way out did not exist. I kept moving forward. Maybe not in the way I once wanted, but step by step I moved. Every day was filled with the same emptiness that was taking over me more and more. The world around me was the same, but it was becoming alien to me. It felt like I had lost a part of myself. And it wasn't just pain, it was a feeling that I didn't exist in the same world as everyone else. Everything that had seemed important before now seemed illusory. My thoughts weren't mine, they were becoming part of this chaos, part of a world I couldn't understand. Every day I woke up with the feeling that this day would be the same as all the others. I did my job, fulfilled my obligations, but there was nothing inside me that could give meaning to this process. Everything was empty, everything was automatic. I was not looking for answers. I could not find them. It was like trying to find stars in the fog. You kind of know they are there, but they disappear behind the clouds when you try to see them. But despite this, I kept moving. Why? Maybe because it was the only thing left to do. To keep going without asking unnecessary questions. But with every step, this path became more and more inaccessible, more and more empty. I knew that I couldn't stop, because if I did, I would completely lose touch with myself and the world. Stopping was dangerous. If I slowed down, I could lose control altogether. So I kept going, despite not knowing where exactly. Every morning was like the one before, but the further I walked, the more I realized that this was not a walk at all. This was a walk into the darkness, into the unknown. And even if I didn't know what was around the next turn, I knew I had to keep going. The more I tried to analyze what was happening, the less I understood. It was like looking at a whirlpool that you were being pulled into, and you couldn't figure out where exactly the force of this attraction was coming from. The riddle of the world was becoming more and more confusing. And even if I tried to go in the direction that seemed right to me, I did not feel that inner satisfaction. There was no longer the confidence that once seemed an integral part of me. I did not know what to do, how to choose the right path. And although outwardly nothing changed, anxiety began to develop inside me, anxiety that grew with each passing day. It was invisible but tangible, and once it could have been just a background, but now was becoming the background that determined everything. I was beginning to realize that this road I was on was not just a metaphor. It was a real path, and I could feel its weight with every step. I could no longer see the future. I couldn't understand what was coming next, or what was happening in my life at all. I wasn't sure that if I stopped, I would be able to return to this world. I couldn't allow myself to stop, because then I would lose touch with reality. I couldn't understand what would have to happen for things to work out, but I knew one thing: if there was no path, no driving force, I would be lost, and perhaps that would be much worse than simply losing myself. Sometimes it seemed to me that I was not alone on this path. I felt like there was something invisible around me. It was not a person or a creature, but it was there. I felt like it was watching me, like someone or something was watching my every move. I did not know what it was, and although I did not want to admit it to myself, I was afraid. Afraid of this presence, this feeling that something was watching me. Each step became heavier, but I kept going, and then at some point I realized that these were not just steps. These were steps into the darkness. I myself was becoming part of this process. I began to understand that this was not just a road. It was a path into the unknown, a path that required not just physical strength, but also fortitude. And the further I went, the more I realized that I could not go back. The path had already been passed, and there was no way back. And then, when I thought all was lost, I noticed something strange. What had seemed impossible before became obvious. The darkness around me was not hostile. It was part of me, part of a process I could not understand. I had become part of this road, part of this path, and no matter what lay ahead, I could no longer stop. I did not know where this path would lead, but I knew one thing: I could not simply stand still. The riddle that stood before me had no answer, but I was no longer trying to find it. I became part of this path, part of what was happening, and it was strange, because at some point, despite all the fears and worries, I began to understand that this was not the end. This was only the beginning. I moved in the darkness, not knowing where this path would lead. It became more than just a test for me. It was something more, something that could not be described in words. There were moments when I felt that if I took one more step, I would lose everything. Not only control, but also my essence. I did not know who I was now or where this journey would end. But one thing was clear: I could not stop, because if I stopped, I would disappear. I would become part of this world, dissolve into it, and that was not something I wanted. The darkness around me grew thicker. I began to realize that it wasn't just the physical darkness that was haunting me. My life had become the same state. My consciousness, my thoughts, everything I knew and that was once my own, began to disappear. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. It was seeping through your fingers, leaving only a feeling of emptiness. Every step I took felt like my last. I couldn't believe that all of this was happening to me. I was ready to turn back, but every time I thought about taking a step in the other direction, I knew that it would only lead me into deeper darkness. I didn't know what to do, I didn't know how to act. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let myself lose control. Even if it meant losing myself. Even if it meant disappearing into that shadow like smoke. That's when I felt it. It was something else. Something I couldn't describe with words. It was there, but I couldn't figure out what it was. It was something that was following me. Something that was sucking the strength out of me. I tried to hide from this feeling, but it was everywhere, in every step, and in Shay. I couldn't escape. With each step, this unknown force grew stronger, and then I realized that I could not fight it anymore. I realized that it was not just fear. It was much more than fear. It was an absorption of my personality, my consciousness. I felt this process happening and I could do nothing about it. It was like being inside someone's dark, deep pit and knowing that everything around you was shrinking. My body kept moving forward, but I felt myself being consumed by this force. It gave me no choice. It was pulling me into an endless darkness, into a void that I could not reach from the outside. I was no longer myself. I couldn't remember the last time I felt alive, when I was a complete person. All that was left was movement. All I did was walk and walk and walk. Sometimes I tried to remember who I was before all this started. But every time I tried, I felt my memories begin to blur. It was like trying to hold sand in my hands. At some point, I realized that I could no longer return to my past. It didn't matter anymore. What I knew, it was all gone. And then, in the madness, I encountered something even worse than the absorption itself. It was the feeling that everything I felt, everything I experienced, didn't matter. The absorption that was following me wasn't just destroying me, it was robbing me of meaning. I didn't know why it was happening, but it was worse than anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just a loss of control, it was a loss of meaning. No matter how hard I tried to fight it, no matter how much I resisted it, I realized that the only way to survive was to accept it. If I continued to resist, I would be torn apart. All I could do was let this absorption happen. I didn't know how long it would last. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew one thing: if I wanted to be alive, I had to let go. With every step I took, I became more and more meaningless. And this feeling of meaninglessness was what really broke me. I stopped noticing where the darkness ended and where I began. I didn't know who or what I was, and this feeling of emptiness became my only friend. At that moment, I realized something strange. This absorption was not only external, it was internal as well. My feelings, my emotions, everything that made up my being began to disappear. I became part of this darkness. I was being absorbed not only by external forces, but also by my own inner world. And despite all my efforts, I could not stop this process. It was as if I myself was part of this shadow, part of what was eating me from the inside. I tried to fight it, but the more I tried, the stronger the mechanism of absorption that was inside me became. It was not just part of the outside world, it was my inner world. And when I realized this, I knew that I could not go back. I had become what I was trying to avoid. I was consumed not only by fear, but by my own existence. And then, when all seemed lost, I felt the process slowing down. It wasn't liberation. It was just a slowdown that didn't allow me to move forward. And at that moment, I realized that I couldn't choose the path. I didn't choose anymore. I was consumed. So time passed and I realized that I was no longer a man. I became what remained of my past. I couldn't remember when I first felt myself slipping away. Maybe it started happening so slowly that I didn't even notice. Or maybe it was when I stopped thinking about time and just started moving, following what was left of me. I didn't know where this path would end, didn't know what was ahead. But one thing was clear: I couldn't go back. I was absorbed in what was happening to me, and every day became a new stage in this strange game where I didn't know who my opponent was. The darkness that surrounded me was not what it had been before. It had changed. It was no longer just emptiness. No longer just the absence of light. It was something alive, something that followed my every step. But the strangest thing was that I began to feel this darkness was not only around me, but inside me. It penetrated my every thought, every cell of my body, as if I were becoming part of this world, part of this abyss. With each step I took, I felt the absorption speeding up. It felt like I was losing everything that had once been important: my memories, my feelings, even my own fear. Everything was disappearing like fog that dissipates at dawn. It was a strange and frightening sensation, as if I were becoming something alien to myself, unable to recognize myself or the world around me. Yet I kept going, as if there was some truth in this movement. There were moments when I tried to stop, but every time I stopped, I felt something dark pulling me back. At first it was easy to ignore, but with each passing day, it became more and more difficult. My own will, my own choice seemed less important to me. At some point, I realized that I no longer decided what was happening. I no longer controlled my life, as if it had become something else, something I could no longer understand. I didn't know where I was. The world around me was unrecognizable. These weren't the same streets, the same buildings. The ground beneath my feet was no longer solid, and the air was heavy and damp, as if the air itself had become part of this darkness. I wondered more and more if I had ever been here in this place. It was as if I had found myself in another time, another world, another dimension, where there were no boundaries between reality and what I thought I knew. One evening, when I was wandering in the dark again, I noticed a silhouette. It was far away, but I knew immediately that it was something or someone that was also part of this world. Its outlines were blurry like everything else, but I couldn't ignore its presence. I felt something crackle inside me, as if I had once again found a piece of something familiar. I stopped and watched. The silhouette didn't move, didn't try to come to me. That was the moment I realized I was not alone. I was not the only creature wandering in this darkness, and although I couldn't understand what it was, I knew it was no accident. I was part of this world, and this silhouette was part of me, and everything that was happening was connected to that, to me, becoming part of something bigger. Not just being consumed, but also part of something that could change everything I knew. I started to move toward him, but my steps were becoming heavy. Not in a physical sense, but in the sense that every movement, every step, was a growing reminder that I couldn't just walk, that I had to be aware of where I was going, that I had to understand what was happening to those who found themselves in this world, in this darkness. Whatever it was, the forces that were consuming me, or something worse, it was part of what was happening to me, and I couldn't escape it anymore. It was a long time before I finally approached the silhouette, but as I stood there, I realized that it was not what I expected. It was not a being. It was just an image. It was empty, shapeless, like smoke or fog. And yet, despite its meaningless form, I knew it was a part of me. I knew it was something I had created in my mind. It was an image that was showing me something important that I needed to understand. I took a step back and felt the world around me begin to change. It was like perceiving something you can't touch, but that still affects your reality. I couldn't say what was happening, but I knew it wasn't just a mind trick. I was becoming a part of what was happening around me. I was no longer just an observer. I was something that existed in this world, something that interacted with the darkness. With each step I took, I felt more and more that the boundaries were blurring. There was no clear line between what was real and what was illusion. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt that I could no longer go back. I knew that this path had no end, because the path itself was part of what I had become. And at some point I realized I can no longer separate myself from this world. I became a part of it, a part of what existed inside this darkness. And perhaps this was the only thing left for me. Every step became heavier. Every breath became more labored. The world I knew seemed so far away, so impossible to me. I wasn't sure I'd ever lived in that world. Time became unclear, and I couldn't tell how much of what I'd experienced was real, and how much was just a figment of my imagination, a whisper of something I'd created in my mind. And I probably couldn't return to the old reality even if I wanted to. I walked through this world, a world where darkness was not emptiness. Darkness was a living being, something that kept pulling me along, forcing me to move forward, despite my fatigue and doubts. And I couldn't understand where I came from in this place, what was happening to me. All I could do was follow, move on. I thought about what the words victory and defeat mean to me now. I never considered myself a winner. I never aspired to be one. But when you go through such trials, such changes, you understand the process itself, the path itself. That is this victory. And this defeat too, but in its own way. It is not a fall, but a movement that inevitably accompanies you. You cannot be alive and not move. It is simply a law. In this place, among the blurry shadows, I became increasingly aware. I had become something more than just a person. But what? Who was I now? What was I in this new world? I could no longer tell where the I began and where the world in which I existed ended. These questions were unimportant because I had long since stopped trying to understand. The darkness had swallowed me up completely. I was no longer just an observer, no longer just a part of this game. I was a player, and all I had to do was experience it to the end. I could stop, but I knew that would mean disappearing. I could give in, but that would be a betrayal of myself. I was in this world, and I had to see it through to the end, to become who I was meant to be. But at the same time, I began to realize I could no longer think of myself as something separate. I was a part of this world. I could not separate myself from the darkness, and at some point, I realized this was my strength. I was neither a winner nor a loser. I was something other than what I had once known. I had become part of this darkness, part of the game, part of a path that was moving on its own, independent of me. I felt the fear that once possessed me slowly disappear. It was no longer my enemy, no longer something that was supposed to stop me. It was as if I had become the master of this fear, rather than its victim. The fear that once possessed me was now just a ghost, a shadow that no longer had a place in my life. I had learned to control it, to accept it, to be with it. And maybe that was what I was looking for. Not to run from it, but to be with it. The world began to change again. Everything around me began to dissolve in a cloud of this darkness, to disappear into the void. But this time I did not try to resist. I accepted this process. Everything I knew, everything I had ever seen and felt, was disappearing. I knew it was the end of the game, but it was not the end for me, not the end of the road. It was the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. Perhaps I did not understand what was happening, but I knew that I was not saying goodbye to this world. I was becoming a part of it, a part of its cycles and changes. The darkness was no longer an enemy. It was no longer an evil to be defeated. It was simply part of the world, part of existence. I was not looking for victory, not looking for a way out. I was looking only for the understanding that I had become part of something bigger, something that was not limited by my old ideas about life. I stopped thinking about victory as something final as a result. I learned to live in the moment, in the process, in this strange but exciting journey where there was no end. And then, in the midst of all this, I realized I had become what I could call freedom. Not freedom as in the absence of limitations, but freedom from all my previous fears and limitations. I was not a prisoner. I was not a hunter. I was a being who had stopped looking for his way because he had become part of it. I was simply someone who walked, who moved, not knowing where. In this world, in this darkness, I became more than just a part of it. I became a part of it all, a part of its endless game. And even as everything around me disappeared, I knew I was not alone. I became all of it, everything that had ever existed in this world.